Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and settle into wherever you are tonight. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere else you need to be. Tonight we turn to someone the herbs and the roots have not yet told us about directly. Not the plants themselves, but the hands that gathered them. The village wise woman. The cunning woman at the edge of the parish. The granny woman down the lane. The one who knew which leaf eased a fever, and which word, spoken softly over a cradle, was thought to settle a restless child. 100 quiet facts about her life, her garden, her kitchen, her birthing room, and the long, uneasy border. She walked between being loved by her neighbors and feared by the same people in the same season. We will move through them slowly, a small handful at a time, gathered into gentle chapters, the way she herself might have gathered a handful of chamomile at dusk. Imagine, if you will, a low stone cottage at the edge of a medieval village. Smoke rises thin and grey from the chimney. The door stands a little open to the evening air, and along the path to it grow small crowded plants, rue and feverfew and calendula, planted so close together that a visitor's skirts brush against 3 or 4 of them before ever reaching the step. Inside, dried bundles hang from the beams, and a stone jar of honeyed vinegar stands warming near the hearth. This is where we will spend our night. Slow, unhurried, steady as the small flame in the window that told a laboring mother, however far off, that help was awake and waiting. There is no need to follow every word. Let your attention come and go as it pleases. We have a great many hours ahead of us, and a great many quiet facts still to come, and none of them will mind in the least. If you drift off partway through and miss the rest until morning, let us begin with who she was. The wise woman rarely had a single name for what she did, though her neighbors had many for her. In one village she might be the wise woman, in the next the cunning woman, and in a third simply the woman who knew. She was not, in the beginning, a figure of dread. She was consulted before the physician, because there was no physician within a day's walk, and consulted instead of the physician because his fee was silver, and hers was often a basket of eggs or an afternoon's labor in her own garden. She set bones. She brought children into the world. She eased fevers, and she sat with the dying when the priest was called elsewhere. Her knowledge did not come from any university, for no university of the medieval world would have admitted her, and so it came instead from a longer and quieter school, the one that passed directly from an old woman's hands into a young woman's memory. It is worth pausing on how ordinary this all felt from the inside. She did not think of herself as unusual or brave or especially wise. She thought of herself, most days, simply as busy, moving between a birth in one lane and a fevered child in another, stopping to check a poultice on a third collar's hand along the way. The word remarkable, so often applied to her now, would likely have puzzled her. To her own eyes she was only doing what needed doing, the way her mother had done it before her, and her grandmother before that. Let us turn now to where she lived. Her cottage stood, more often than not, a little apart from the cluster of the village proper, near the last field before the common land began, or beside the crossing of 2 old paths. This was rarely an accident. A house at the village edge was easier to reach at any hour of the night, without waking half the parish to answer a frightened knock, and it kept the stronger smells of her trade, the simmering roots, the tanning of a poultice, a little further from her neighbours' doors. It also meant her garden could spread untidily in whatever direction the plants themselves preferred, climbing the wall on the shaded side, spilling along the ditch where the ground stayed damp. Travellers passing at dusk sometimes said they could find her house by scent alone, long before they could see its low thatched roof against the darkening sky. A house at the village edge also gave her something else, a kind of privacy that suited the work. Families arriving with a trouble they did not wish the whole village to know of, an unmarried daughter's condition, a husband's failing strength, a private grief, could reach her door without passing every window in the parish first. This quiet discretion, offered without ever being asked for directly, was itself part of what her neighbours paid her for, though it rarely appears written down in any account book. We will turn now to how she learned her trade. Almost without exception, she had not chosen this work so much as grown into it. A daughter watched her mother strain a decoction through a cloth 1,000 times before she was ever asked to hold the cloth herself. A niece was sent, some summers, to help an aunt gather nettle at first light, and was taught, without ever being told she was being taught, which leaf to take and which to leave standing. There were no written manuals for most of this learning, no diagrams, no formal examinations. The knowledge moved by watching, by small correction, by rhyme and repetition, until one day the girl, who had only ever fetched water and held the basket, found that her own hands now knew, without pausing to think, exactly how much yarrow a wound required. This kind of learning left its mark on the body as much as the mind. An experienced wise woman's hands were often described, in the few personal accounts that survive, as rough and stained, deeply calloused from years of grinding root and stripping bark, and yet remarkably gentle at the bedside, capable of the lightest possible touch on a newborn's skin or a fevered brow. Neighbors came to trust those hands specifically, sometimes preferring an older, visibly worn healer over a younger one for exactly this reason. Let us turn now to the basket she carried. When she was called from her cottage, she rarely went empty-handed. A woven basket, kept always ready near the door, held the things she was most likely to need: dried herbs wrapped in small linen parcels and labelled, where she could not read or write herself, by knot, color of thread, or simply by memory of their order in the basket. A small clean cloth for binding, a stub of tallow candle, sometimes a stone or a coin worn smooth, carried more for the comfort it gave the frightened family than for any medicine in it. She kept this basket the way a physician of the town kept his case of instruments, and losing it, or having it borrowed and not returned, could mean a difficult night for whoever called on her next. The basket itself was often a gift, woven by the wise woman's own mother or teacher, and handed down along with everything it usually carried. A few surviving examples, preserved in regional folk museums, show unmistakable signs of decades of hard use, the willow strands worn smooth and dark at the handle from thousands of hurried departures into the night. We turn now to her standing among her neighbors. For most of her working life, in most villages, she held a kind of quiet respect that sat somewhere between the priest and the blacksmith. People brought her their aches before they brought them to anyone else, because she was near, because she was known, and because, more often than a modern listener might expect, Her remedies worked well enough for the ordinary complaints of village life. A record from a small parish in the Cotswolds notes a woman paid in cloth and grain for tending nearly every birth and every broken bone in the village across 4 decades. Her name recurring again and again in accounts that otherwise mention no other healer at all. She was, in her own time and place, simply how the village looked after itself. This kind of standing, earned slowly over years, could not be granted by any office or title. It had to be proven birth after birth, fever after fever, and it could just as easily be lost. If a run of poor outcomes turned a community's trust the other way. The wise woman understood this better than anyone, and it is one reason her caution around difficult or dangerous cases was often greater than any outsider might expect. Let us turn now to the many names given to her across Europe. In England, she might be a wise woman, a cunning woman, or a handy woman, that last word describing simply someone deft and reliable with her hands. In the German lands, she was often called the Krautjungfrau, the herb woman, or sometimes the Weisfrau. In France, the term Guy receives, the one who heals, covered much the same ground, though a village might also simply say la femme qui sait, the woman who knows. In parts of Scotland and the north she was a spey wife, a word that carried both healing and a little foresight in its meaning. Across the Slavic lands a similar figure appears as the Zielaka, the herb gatherer, trusted with birth, illness, and the small blessings said over both. Whatever the word, the shape of the role was strikingly the same from village to village, as though it had grown up independently and identically wherever people needed exactly this kind of quiet, patient help. Even within a single country, the name could shift from one valley to the next, carried by dialect as much as by custom. A woman traveling only a day's walk from her own parish might find herself called by an entirely unfamiliar term, and it is easy to imagine the small, wry amusement this must have caused among women who otherwise recognized one another's work instantly, tool for tool and herb for herb, regardless of what the local tongue happened to call it. We turn now to the book she never wrote, because so much of her knowledge lived only in memory. Very little of it was ever set down by the women who held it. What survives to us today comes mostly from other hands entirely, from monks copying older Latin herbals, from town physicians grudgingly recording a remedy they had seen work, from court clerks writing down testimony during a trial. The wise woman's own voice is present in these documents only at second hand, filtered through people who did not always understand or value what she knew. And yet certain phrases recur so often, in so many unrelated records across so many centuries, that historians now believe they preserve something close to her own spoken rhymes and sayings, carried down mouth to ear, long before anyone thought to write them at all. A handful of exceptional women did leave a written record of their own, most famously Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century abbess whose careful notes on herbs and healing survive in full to this day, and Trotula of Salerno, whose writing on women's medicine circulated widely across medieval Europe under her own name. These two figures give us a rare, direct glimpse of a knowledge that, for every other wise woman in every other village, has come down to us only in echo. Let us turn now to her garden and the small, crowded plot she kept just beyond her own door. The plants nearest a wise woman's threshold were rarely there by chance. She grew close by the door where she would pass them 12 times a day. The herbs she reached for most often and trusted most completely. The first, almost everywhere in medieval Europe, was rue, a low, blue-green, bitter-smelling shrub. Rue was planted directly beside the doorstep in cottage after cottage, valued both as a wound herb, its bruised leaves pressed onto cuts and stings, and as a plant believed to turn aside illness, and ill will simply by growing where a visitor had to pass it to enter the house. Herbalists of the period recommended a few drops of its juice for Iraq and its dried leaf burned to clear a sick room of foul air, and country memory held that a sprig worn in the hatband kept the wearer safe on a long, uncertain road. Rue was handled with a particular respect in the garden itself, since its sap could raise a rash on bare skin in strong sunlight, a fact every wise woman learned early, usually the hard way, and passed on carefully to any apprentice working near it for the first time. Despite this small hazard, or perhaps partly because of it, rue kept its reputation across the centuries as one of the most trusted and most widely planted herbs of the entire dooryard garden. Let us turn to the second plant of the dooryard. Feverfew grew almost as commonly, its small daisy-like flowers and pale green, faintly citrus-scented leaves lining the path beside rue in garden after garden. Its very name told most of what it was for. A few fresh leaves, chewed slowly or steeped into a bitter tea, were the standard village answer to a headache, and particularly to the long, throbbing kind that returned again and again through a woman's working life. It was also given, in smaller amounts, to bring down a child's fever through the worst of a long night, the mother sitting beside the bed and pressing a cooled cloth to the forehead between doses. A note from a household account in the Low Countries records feverfew bought fresh from a local woman 3 separate times in a single difficult winter, always alongside a small payment of cheese. Feverfew's bitterness was often disguised, when it was given to children especially, folded into a spoonful of honey or a warm posset, rather than offered as a plain tea. A wise woman's small tricks for making a bitter remedy bearable, learned entirely through trial, and a great deal of patient repetition, were themselves a quiet and rarely acknowledged part of her craft. We turn now to the marigold, calendula, glowing gold along the same short path. Calendula asked for almost nothing from the gardener, and gave back a great deal in return. Its bright orange and yellow petals, opening reliably through most of the growing year. The wise woman prized it above nearly every other flower for wounds, working its crushed petals into a soft salve with rendered fat or beeswax, and spreading it over cuts, burns, and the raw, chapped skin of hands worked hard through a long winter. A weak infusion of the petals was also given for an unsettled stomach, and the dried flowers, added to a pot of ordinary broth, were said to lift a low and heavy mood in someone recovering slowly from a long illness. Village memory held that calendula opened its face fully only in sunlight and closed it again toward evening, as though it kept its own small clock by the door. Because it flowered so reliably and for so long, calendula was often the very first herb a young apprentice was taught to identify, pick, and prepare on her own, a gentle, forgiving plant to practice on before she was trusted with anything more delicate or more dangerous. Let us turn to comfrey, the great healer of broken places. Comfrey grew larger and rougher than its neighbors, tall and broad-leaved, often planted along a shaded wall where little else would thrive so easily. Its old country name, Knitbone, described its whole reputation at once. The root, grated and made into a thick paste with warm water, was packed and bound over a broken limb, and as it dried it hardened into something close to a light cast, holding the bone steady while it mended beneath. The leaves, bruised and applied directly, were used for sprains, bruises, and the deep soreness that followed a hard fall from a cart or a horse. A physician traveling through rural France in the later medieval period wrote, with some surprise, that he had seen village bone setters achieve results with comfrey poultices that matched his own careful splinting at a fraction of the trouble. The root itself was dug carefully and only in modest amounts, since a healthy comfrey plant, left with enough of its root intact, would return reliably the following spring, thicker and more generous than before. A wise woman rarely dug the whole clump at once, taking instead what she needed and leaving the rest quietly for next winter's inevitable broken arm. We turn now to Lovage, standing tall and green near the kitchen door itself. Lovage grew close to the kitchen rather than the front step, since it served the cooking pot nearly as often as the medicine chest. Its long stalks and dark, celery-scented leaves flavored broths and pottages through the colder months, and this was itself a form of medicine in a household's eyes, since a warming, well-seasoned broth was thought to strengthen a weak constitution as surely as any bitter tincture. The root, dried and powdered, was given in small amounts for a troubled digestion and for the gripping pain that followed a poor or hurried meal. Some village records also mention lovage water used to freshen linen and to sweeten the breath, a gentler, everyday use tucked in alongside its more serious medicinal ones. A single lovage plant, once established, could tower well above head height by late summer, and its sheer usefulness across so many small daily tasks made it one of the very few herbs a wise woman would go to real trouble to protect through a hard winter, sometimes covering its crown with straw against the frost. Let us turn to southernwood, sometimes called lad's love, hung to dry above the porch. Southernwood was less often planted than gathered and hung, small silvery grey bundles of it tied above doorways and porches through much of northern Europe. Its sharp, faintly lemon scent was believed to discourage moths from woolens stored nearby, a practical household use that sat comfortably alongside its medicinal ones. A weak infusion of the leaves was given for worms in children in careful small doses, and the crushed foliage was rubbed on the skin in some regions as a guard against biting insects through the long summer evenings. Its old country name came from a courting custom, a sprig worn or given as a small, quiet sign of affection between a young man and a young woman, a use so widespread that a bride's mother might plant a fresh clump the same season a daughter came of age. The courting association gave southernwood a slightly different place in village life than most of the wise woman's other herbs, half medicine and half small social custom, and she was as likely to be asked for a fresh sprig by a nervous young suitor as by a mother worried about her child's stomach. We turn now to the house leek, growing not in the garden bed at all, but directly on the roof. The house leek was unusual among the dooryard plants, in where it was allowed to grow, rooted deliberately into the thatch or the tiles of the roof itself, rather than in the soil below. Thick, fleshy rosettes clung there through every season, needing almost no care, and country belief held that a roof planted with house leek was less likely to be struck by lightning during a summer storm. The plant sometimes called Jupiter's beard for this very reason. Whatever truth lay behind the belief, the plant had a genuine medicinal use as well. Its cool, moist leaves split open and pressed directly onto a burn or a sting to draw out the heat and ease the pain almost at once. A wise woman with house leek, established on her own roof, rarely needed to look far for a remedy to a kitchen burn. Because it grew so far above the ordinary garden, tending it required a certain nerve, and more than one account describes a wise woman, or more often her apprentice, climbing carefully onto the thatch itself to renew a thinning patch, a small, unglamorous act of maintenance that kept a very useful remedy always within reach. Let us turn now, gently, from the garden by the door to the wider hedgerow beyond it, and to the quiet customs of gathering what grew wild. There was, in nearly every region of medieval Europe, a right way and a wrong way to take a plant from the hedgerow, and the wise woman observed these customs as carefully as she observed the plants themselves. The first and most widely recorded rule concerned the hour of gathering. Herbs picked at first light, while the dew still lay heavy on the leaf, were held to be at their fullest strength, before the rising sun had drawn off whatever unseen virtue the night had gathered into them. A woman might rise well before the rest of her household on a morning when a particular herb was needed fresh, walking the hedgerow alone in the grey hour before the village properly woke. There was a particular stillness to those early walks that several later folklorists, collecting the last living memories of the practice, described almost wistfully. The world grey and hushed, the only sound the wise woman's own footsteps and the occasional startled bird, a private hour that belonged to her and to no one else in the parish. We turn now to gathering by the moon. Alongside the hour of the day, many wise women kept careful account of the moon's phase before setting out to gather. Roots and bulbs, the parts of the plant that grew downward and inward, were often gathered as the moon waned, on the understanding that the plant's strength withdrew into the earth in that same season, concentrating itself below ground. Flowers and leaves, by contrast, were more often gathered as the moon waxed toward fullness, when the plant's energy was thought to rise upward and outward into exactly the parts that would be used. Whether or not the timing changed the medicine in any way a modern chemist could measure, it gave the whole practice of gathering a steady, unhurried rhythm, tied to something larger and slower than any single week. This lunar rhythm meant a wise woman effectively kept two calendars running at once in her head, the fixed agricultural seasons that governed everyone in the village, and the finer, monthly cycle of the moon that governed her more specifically. Balancing both, without ever writing either down, was itself a quiet feat of memory that modern listeners, surrounded by written calendars and clocks, might easily underestimate. Let us turn now to the small courtesy of asking the plant's leave. Before cutting or pulling a wild herb, it was common practice across a wide stretch of medieval Europe to pause and speak a few quiet words to the plant itself, asking its leave or thanking it, before taking what was needed. The exact words varied enormously from region to region and were rarely written down, since they were spoken, not read. But their general shape recurs again and again in later folklore collections, a small blessing offered before the first cut of the knife. This was not thought to be idle superstition by the women who practiced it. It was simply good manners, extended to a living thing that was about to give something of itself for the sake of a sick neighbor. A young apprentice was taught this courtesy before she was taught almost anything else about gathering, and it is easy to imagine how naturally it must have become habit. The small pause, the quiet words, repeated so many hundreds of times across a working life that it eventually needed no thought at all. We turn now to the rule of never taking the first and never taking the last. Wherever a stand of a useful herb was found growing wild, custom generally forbade taking the very first plant encountered and the very last one remaining in a patch. The first was left, in many accounts, as an offering, a small thanks paid before the harvest properly began. The last was left so that the patch itself might seed again the following year, and so that whoever came after, whether woman, bird, or beast, would find something still standing. This simple rule, followed patiently across generations without any written law behind it, helped keep the hedgerows of a parish supplied with medicine long after other, more heedless practices might have stripped them bare. Modern botanists studying sustainable wild harvesting have noted, with a certain quiet admiration, how closely this old rule matches what careful ecological management would recommend today, a piece of practical wisdom arrived at centuries earlier through nothing more than patient, generational observation. Let us turn now to the digging knife, kept apart from every other tool in the house. Many wise women kept a single blade set aside entirely for cutting and digging herbs, distinct from the knife used at the table or in the kitchen. In several regions this blade was specifically white-handled, its handle carved from bone or pale wood, rather than the darker horn common to ordinary knives, and its use was reserved strictly for the garden and the hedgerow. Some accounts describe the blade being kept clean not only in the practical sense, but in a more careful, almost ceremonial one, wiped and put away with attention after each use. A borrowed digging knife, in the folklore of several regions, was thought to carry a little of its owner's fortune with it, which may explain why so many women preferred to keep their own close at hand. A well-kept digging knife might serve a single wise woman for the whole of her working life, and more than one surviving example, small and plain and worn thin along one edge from decades of careful sharpening, has been found passed down among a family's other modest heirlooms, unremarked in every way, except for how completely it had been used. We turn now to St. John's Eve and the belief that herbs gathered on that single midsummer night carried unusual strength. Across a great stretch of medieval Europe, the eve of the summer solstice, tied by the church calendar to the feast of St. John, was held to be the single best night of the year for gathering certain herbs, particularly St. John's wort, whose very name preserves the association. Bonfires were lit in many villages that night, and herbs gathered in the hours around the fire and the solstice sun were dried and kept through the following year as the most potent stock in the wise woman's store. Some accounts describe entire families walking out together into the fields at dusk on this one evening, a rare occasion when gathering became a shared, almost festive task rather than the solitary work of a single woman before dawn. For the wise woman herself, Midsummer Eve was often the single busiest gathering night of her whole year. and she likely slept very little of it, moving from hedgerow to hedgerow while the fires burned and her neighbors sang and danced around them, filling her basket steadily while the rest of the village kept its rare and welcome holiday. Let us turn, to close this part of our evening, to the elder tree and the particular respect it was owed above every other plant in the hedgerow. Of all the plants a wise woman might gather from, none was treated with quite so much careful courtesy as the elder. Widespread folklore across northern Europe held that the tree was home to a spirit, often called the Elder Mother, and that cutting even a single branch without first asking her leave, aloud, might bring misfortune down on the one who cut it. Once permission was properly asked, however, the elder gave generously. Its flowers, gathered in early summer, were made into a cooling drink for fevers and a wash for tired eyes. Its dark berries, gathered in autumn, were cooked into syrups that saw many a village household through the coughs and chills of the coming winter. A wise woman kept, without needing to say so aloud, a small store of both, and a great deal of quiet respect for the tree that gave them. An elder tree growing beside a cottage was, in many regions, treated almost as a member of the household in its own right, spoken to in passing, thanked after a good harvest of berries, and never cut down entirely, whatever the reason, without a great deal of careful thought, and more often than not, a formal little ceremony of apology first. Let us turn now to a quieter part of her work, the words she spoke alongside the medicine, and the small blessings that traveled with every remedy she gave. Very little of what a wise woman did was medicine alone, in the narrow sense a modern listener might expect. Almost every remedy she prepared was accompanied by something spoken, a short verse, a blessing, a phrase repeated a fixed number of times, while a poultice was bound or a tea was stirred. These were not thought to replace the herb's own working. Rather, they were understood to steady the hand that gave it and settle the mind that received it. And in a world where illness was frightening and poorly understood, that steadying counted for a great deal. A record from a German-speaking region describes a healer reciting the same short verse over a wound 3 times while binding it, her neighbors reporting afterward, without any sense of contradiction, both that the herb had drawn out the poison and that the words had helped the wound close clean. This blending of practical remedy and spoken blessing was so complete. In the wise woman's own understanding of her work, that separating the two would have made little sense to her at all. The words were simply part of the treatment, no more separable from the poultice than the bandage that held it in place. We turn now to the saints most often called upon in these small spoken blessings. Certain saints appear again and again across the surviving charms of medieval Europe, called on for very specific troubles, almost the way a modern household might reach for a particular remedy from a cabinet. Saint Apollonia, said to have suffered greatly before her death, was invoked for toothache. Saint Blaise, remembered for saving a child from choking, was called on for troubles of the throat. Saint Margaret, patroness of childbirth, was named more often than any other figure in the charms spoken over a laboring woman. A wise woman did not need to be especially devout to know which saint belonged to which trouble. This knowledge was simply part of her trade, learned alongside the herbs themselves, and applied with the same quiet confidence. Local parish churches often kept a small painted image or carving of the particular saint most called upon by the village healer, and it was not unusual for a wise woman to walk a sick neighbor, or a neighbor's worried mother, the short distance to the church itself, so the blessing could be spoken in the saint's own painted presence, rather than only in the sick room. Let us turn now to the written charm, folded small and carried close to the skin. Where a spoken blessing was not thought sufficient on its own, a wise woman sometimes wrote out a short charm on a scrap of parchment or paper, folded it tightly, and had the sufferer wear it against the skin, often sewn into a small pouch worn around the neck or tied at the wrist. The words on these charms ranged from short prayers to strings of letters and symbols, whose precise meaning had been passed down without full explanation, even to the woman who wrote them. Several such folded papers survive today, tucked inside the bindings of old account books, or found sewn into the lining of preserved garments, most addressing fevers, difficult childbirth, or the ordinary ache that returned again and again through a damp medieval winter. Because many wise women could not write, the charm itself was sometimes prepared by a sympathetic parish clerk or a literate relative, copying out words the wise woman dictated from memory, a small but telling collaboration between her oral knowledge and someone else's more formal, written skill. We turn now to the number 3 and its quiet, constant presence in her practice. Across an enormous range of charms, blessings, and small rituals recorded from medieval Europe, the number 3 appears with striking consistency. A charm was recited 3 times. A poultice was bound with 3 turns of cloth. Water for a wash was drawn from the well before dawn on 3 separate mornings. Historians have connected this pattern both to older, pre-Christian traditions that favored 3s in their own right, and to the comfortable overlay this gave with the Christian Trinity, allowing an old practice to continue easily under a newer faith without any sense, on the part of the woman performing it, that she was doing anything but the sensible, careful thing. This quiet layering of older and newer belief, one comfortably resting inside the other, appears again and again throughout the wise woman's practice, and it is one of the reasons her work survived, largely unremarked for so many centuries before it drew the sharper, more hostile attention that would eventually follow. Let us turn now to the knot, tied and then, when the fever broke, deliberately untied. A particular kind of charm involved tying a knot into a length of thread, ribbon, or a strip of cloth taken from the sufferer's own clothing, while a short blessing was spoken over the knot itself. This knotted thread might then be worn or hung near the sickbed, or in some accounts, buried beneath the threshold of the house. When the illness passed, the knot was carefully found and untied, the loosening of the thread understood to mirror the loosening of the fever's grip on the body. Village memory in several regions held that untying the knot too soon could bring the illness back, which gave families a small, patient reason to wait out the last uncertain days of a recovery, rather than declaring it over too quickly. Something of this old knot magic survives, almost unrecognized, in expressions still used today about tying up loose ends or a difficulty finally coming undone, small linguistic traces of a practice most of us have otherwise entirely forgotten. We turn now to the blessing spoken specifically over a bleeding wound. Charms to stop bleeding form one of the largest and most consistently recorded categories of medieval healing verse, appearing in strikingly similar form from England to the German lands to parts of Scandinavia. Many follow a shared pattern, invoking a moment from Scripture, most often the wound given to Christ, and asking that the blood before the healer stop flowing just as that older wound was said to have stopped. Whatever the theology behind them, these blood charms were spoken by wise women at the site of countless ordinary accidents: a cut from a scythe, a kick from a plough horse, a fall onto broken ground. Standing alongside the actual pressure and binding that did the real work of closing the wound. The remarkable consistency of these blood charms across such distant regions and languages has fascinated later folklorists, who see in it evidence of an extremely old shared tradition, likely far older than the Christian imagery layered onto it, carried and adapted quietly by generations of women who needed, above all, something reliable to say at the worst moments of an ordinary working day. Let us turn now gently to the birthing room and the woman who was, in nearly every medieval village, its quiet and undisputed authority. Of all the work a wise woman did, none was more central to her standing in the community than her presence at childbirth. She was called, almost without exception, before any male physician. And in a great many villages, she was the only attendant a laboring woman ever saw. Her knowledge here was practical and hard-won, built from attending birth after birth across a long working life, learning which positions eased a difficult labor, which herbs steadied a mother's strength, and, perhaps most valuably, when a birth was progressing normally enough, that patience alone was the best medicine. A skilled, wise woman might attend several hundred births across the whole of her working life, an extraordinary accumulation of direct experience that no formally trained physician of the period, barred by custom from the birthing room entirely, could ever hope to match. We turn now to the herbs kept close at hand through a long labor. Certain plants appear again and again in records of the birthing room. Raspberry leaf, brewed as a tea through the final weeks of pregnancy and sipped through labor itself, was widely believed to ease and strengthen the contractions of the womb. Motherwort, true to its very name, was given to calm a frightened or exhausted mother between the hardest waves of labor, its bitter taste softened with a little honey when it could be spared. Pennyroyal was known and used across the continent, though handled with particular caution, since the same properties that made it useful in small amounts made it dangerous in larger ones, a distinction every experienced wise woman understood and guarded carefully. The careful, precise dosing this required, learned entirely through observation rather than any written formula, represents one of the most demanding and least celebrated aspects of the wise woman's entire skill, a body of exact, life or death knowledge held quietly in memory alone. Let us turn now to the birthing stool and the position it allowed a laboring woman to take. Rather than lying flat, as later centuries of formal medicine would often prefer, medieval birthing customs across much of Europe favored an upright or semi-upright position, supported by a specially made birthing stool, a low, sturdy chair with a crescent-shaped opening cut into the seat. The wise woman knelt or crouched before this stool to receive the child, while other women of the household or neighborhood stood behind and beside the laboring mother, supporting her weight and murmuring encouragement. Several surviving stools, plain and heavily worn, can still be seen in regional museums today, quiet, physical evidence of a practice that involved, in most villages, nearly every woman in the household at some point in her life. Modern medical understanding has, in recent decades, come back around to recognizing real advantages in this upright position for many laboring women. A quiet vindication of a practice that medieval wise women arrived at simply by watching, over many years, what seemed to work best for the women in front of them. We turn now to the company kept in the birthing room and the strict absence of men. Childbirth in the medieval period was, almost everywhere, a strictly female event. The father of the child waited elsewhere in the house, or outside it entirely, and the room itself filled instead with the wise woman, perhaps a second, more junior helper she was training, and a small circle of the mother's female relatives and neighbors. This gathering served a medical purpose, extra hands for a difficult delivery, but also a deeply social one, a shared and repeated experience that bound the women of a village together across generations, each of them present, in turn, at births they would later attend themselves as the older woman in the room. The gathered women in a birthing room often brought their own small contributions along with them, a favorite cushion, a particular remedy of their own, a song or verse remembered from their own labors, so that the wise woman presided over the birth, while drawing, quietly, on the accumulated experience of every woman present. Let us turn now to the call, and the particular care taken when a child was born still wrapped inside it. On rare occasions, a child was born with part of the birth membrane still covering its head, a call, and this was treated across a wide stretch of medieval Europe as a significant and generally fortunate sign. The wise woman removed it carefully and often preserved it, dried, in a small cloth or box, believed in many regions to protect its bearer from drowning throughout their life. Sailors were known to pay well for a preserved call before a long voyage, and a wise woman who had attended such a birth might find the small dried membrane more valuable, in the eyes of her neighbors, than almost anything else in her basket. A family that possessed a preserved caul sometimes kept it for generations, passed down as a small household treasure, long after the infant it once covered had grown old and died. A strange and touching survival of a single, ordinary night in the birthing room. We turn now to the naming and washing of the newborn, tasks that fell to her as surely as the birth itself. Once a child was safely delivered, it was the wise woman, more often than the mother herself in those first exhausted hours, who washed the infant, checked its small limbs, and wrapped it warmly before placing it at last into its mother's arms. In many regions, she also had a customary role in the earliest naming rituals, sometimes marking the child's forehead with a little salt or ash as an old protective gesture that predated, and long outlasted, the formal christening that would follow within the church a few days later. In cases where a newborn seemed extremely weak and unlikely to survive the night, some regions permitted the wise woman herself to perform a simple, informal baptism at the bedside, so that the infant would not die entirely outside the faith, a quiet and weighty responsibility placed on her shoulders alongside all her other work. Let us turn now to the days that followed a birth and her continued presence through them. A wise woman's responsibility rarely ended the moment the child was delivered. She often returned daily through the following week or two, checking the healing of the mother, watching for the fever that could follow a difficult birth, and advising on the first feeding of the infant. This period of continued care, sometimes called lying in across several regions, was itself governed by careful custom. The new mother kept warm, fed richly, and largely excused from her usual labor, with the wise woman acting almost as the overseer of the household's patients during those fragile early days. It was during exactly this period, watching closely for the childbed fever that claimed so many mothers in the weeks after delivery, that a wise woman's careful attention to cleanliness, whether or not she could have explained why it mattered in modern terms, likely saved a great many lives that would otherwise have been lost to infection. We turn now to her knowledge of women's remedies more broadly, beyond birth itself. Alongside childbirth, the wise woman held a body of knowledge concerning the whole of a woman's reproductive life that no other figure in the village, and very few physicians in the towns, possessed in comparable depth. Irregular or painful monthly courses, difficulty conceiving, the long discomforts that could follow a hard birth, all of these were brought to her rather than spoken of openly elsewhere, and she answered them with a combination of herb, diet, and quiet, practical advice built from decades of listening to exactly these troubles. This body of knowledge concerning matters that medieval society otherwise discussed only reluctantly made the wise woman a uniquely trusted confidante for the women of her village, someone who had heard every private trouble many times before and could be relied upon never to speak of it again outside her own quiet cottage. Let us turn now to the herbs kept for a woman's monthly courses. Mugwort and pennyroyal both appear repeatedly in records concerning irregular or painful courses, taken as a warm tea in modest amounts to ease cramping and encourage a delayed cycle to begin. Yarrow, too, held a long reputation here. Its slightly bitter tea offered both to steady heavy bleeding and, prepared differently, to encourage a light one. As with the herbs of the birthing room, dosage mattered enormously, and the wise woman's careful sense of how much was helpful and how much was harmful represented one of the most valuable, least visible parts of her whole trade. A warm compress, laid across the lower stomach alongside whichever tea was given, was recorded almost as often as the herbs themselves, a simple, comforting measure any woman could prepare for herself, once the wise woman had shown her how, extending the healer's care quietly into the household, long after she herself had gone home. We turn now to fertility, and the quiet requests she received most often in private. Requests for help conceiving a child were among the most frequent and most privately made of all the concerns brought to a wise woman's door. Her responses ranged from herbal preparations, often built around fertility-associated plants like vervain or mugwort, to simple, practical counsel about timing and rest, to small charms carried or worn discreetly. Whatever the method, the fact that couples across the social spectrum, not only the poorest villagers, but occasionally the wives of minor gentry as well, sought her out for exactly this trouble, tells us something about how widely her particular expertise was trusted, even by those who might otherwise have looked first to a physician in the town. These quiet consultations, conducted with real discretion on both sides, meant a wise woman often held some of the most sensitive knowledge in the entire village, aware of hopes and disappointments that a couple might never have shared with their own closest relatives. Let us turn now to the long years after childbearing and the remedies she kept for what later ages would call the change of life. The discomforts of later midlife, the flushes of heat, the disturbed sleep, the shifting moods that a woman might experience in her middle years were recognized and treated in the medieval village every bit as much as they are recognized today, if not always by the same name. Sage tea, taken cool, was a widespread remedy for the sudden heat and sweating many women described, and motherwort was again reached for to ease a troubled or unsettled temper. There was no formal medical term for this whole stage of a woman's life in most village records, but there was, consistently, a wise woman ready with a remedy for whatever discomfort it brought. Many wise women reaching this same stage of life themselves brought a particular, hard-won empathy to these consultations, having lived through the very discomforts they were now easing in a neighbor, a shared understanding that needed very few words to pass between two women who both simply knew. Let us turn now to the kitchen, and to the quiet truth that in the wise woman's household, cooking and medicine were very rarely two separate things. A modern listener, hearing the word medicine, tends to picture something bitter, measured carefully, and kept apart from the ordinary business of eating. In the medieval household, this line barely existed. The broth simmering over the fire for supper was, in the wise woman's understanding, doing much the same work as the tincture on her shelf, warming the blood, restoring strength, settling the humors that medieval medicine believed governed the whole of a person's health. She did not think of herself as switching roles between cook and healer through the course of a day. She thought of herself as doing one continuous, patient work, and the kitchen fire was as much a part of her practice as the drying rack of herbs hanging above it. This blending of kitchen and cure meant a wise woman's ordinary evening meal, served to her own family, was itself a kind of quiet, ongoing medicine, adjusted subtly according to who at her own table seemed tired or pale, or slow to recover from whatever small trouble had passed through the household that season. We turn now to the posset, perhaps the single most widespread remedy of the medieval kitchen. A posset was, at its simplest, warm milk curdled slightly with oil, wine, or a little vinegar, sweetened with honey, and very often flavored with whatever herb the particular illness called for. Ginger for a chill, sage for a sore throat, thyme for a troublesome cough. It was given to almost everyone in the household at almost every stage of illness, from the earliest signs of a cold through the long, slow recovery from a serious fever, because it was gentle enough for the weakest stomach and warming enough to feel, immediately, like comfort rather than medicine. A wise woman's exact posset recipe, refined over years and rarely written down in full, was often one of the things most specifically remembered about her after her death, repeated by name in a village long after the woman herself was gone. A well-made posset was judged as much by its texture as by its ingredients. The curds soft and small rather than tough. The whole drink smooth enough to be taken easily by an invalid too weak to manage anything more solid, and a wise woman's particular skill in getting this balance right was, in its own quiet way, a genuine culinary art. Let us turn now to the caudle, a close cousin of the posset kept specifically for the very weak and the recently delivered. Richer and thicker than an ordinary posset, a caudle was built from warm ile, or wine thickened with egg yolk and oatmeal, sweetened generously, and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg where the household could afford it. It was the standard nourishment given to a new mother in the days following childbirth, and to anyone recovering from a serious illness whose strength had to be coaxed back, gradually rather than all at once. Guests who visited a lying-in mother were often given a small cup of the same caudle themselves, a custom that turned a medicinal food into a small social occasion. The wise woman's recipe shared out among the very people who had likely helped at the birth itself. In wealthier households, the caudle cup itself was sometimes a small treasured object, kept specifically for this purpose, and passed between families for a lying-in visit, a piece of ordinary domestic ceremony that quietly reinforced how central the wise woman's recipes had become to the rhythms of village life. We turn now to the pottage pot, kept simmering nearly all day over the household fire. The ordinary pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew that formed the backbone of most medieval meals, was quietly adjusted by the wise woman, according to who in the household needed what. A weak or recovering member of the family might have their portion enriched with extra barley and a handful of nourishing herbs like lovage or nettle, while someone troubled by a heavy, sluggish digestion might find their bowl seasoned, instead with warming spices meant to stir the appetite. Because the same pot fed the whole household, these adjustments were often subtle. A particular handful added at a particular moment, a skill built entirely from long practice rather than any written measure. A wise woman tending a large household through a difficult winter might, in effect, be preparing several slightly different medicines from the very same pot, ladled out differently to different bowls, a quiet, continuous act of care that her family likely never thought to remark upon at all. Let us turn now to honey, kept close at hand in nearly every remedy she prepared. Honey served the wise woman in more ways than almost any other single substance in her kitchen. It sweetened bitter tinctures enough to make them bearable, particularly for children. Spread directly and thickly over a wound, it was recognized, long before anyone understood why, as remarkably effective at keeping infection from taking hold. A used modern medicine has since confirmed through honey's genuine antibacterial properties. Mixed with vinegar into a drink called oxymel, it was given for coughs and sore throats through the whole of the medieval period and long beyond it. A household that kept its own bees, as many wise women's households did, held a real and practical advantage over neighbors who had to buy honey dear at market. Tending the hives fell, in many households, to the wise woman herself or to whichever apprentice she was training, and the careful, unhurried movements this required, learned as much by feel as by instruction, mirrored in a small way the same patient temperament her medical work demanded of her every single day. We turn now to vinegar, the second great preserving and healing liquid of her kitchen. Alongside honey, vinegar appeared constantly throughout the wise woman's practice, used to draw the medicinal properties out of herbs into a liquid that would keep for months rather than days. Herb-infused vinegars, rue vinegar and rosemary vinegar among the most common, were kept on hand for fainting spells, headaches, and the general staleness of a sick room that had been shut up too long against the cold. During outbreaks of plague, a preparation known across much of Europe as Four Thieves vinegar, steeped with a mixture of protective and strongly scented herbs, was carried by many who had to move among the sick, sprinkled on cloths held to the nose and mouth in the belief that it kept the bad air of contagion at bay. A large jar of herb-infused vinegar, steeping quietly on a back shelf for weeks before it was ready, represented exactly the kind of patient, unhurried preparation that filled so much of a wise woman's ordinary working life, invisible to her neighbors until the very moment it was needed. Let us turn now to the drying loft, the quiet upper room where a whole year's medicine slowly took shape. Above the main room of nearly every wise woman's cottage lay a low loft or rafter space kept specifically for drying. Bundles of herbs hung upside down in tidy rows through the late summer and autumn, their leaves and flowers curing slowly in the warm, dry air that rose naturally to the top of the house. A well-organized drying loft represented, in a very real sense, the wise woman's entire winter's work laid out, where she could reach it, and losing a season's harvest to damp or mold, which did sometimes happen in a particularly wet autumn, could mean real hardship for the households that depended on her through the following months. The loft itself, low-ceilinged and fragrant with 100 mingled herbs, must have been one of the most distinctive spaces in the entire village, and a young apprentice's earliest memories of the trade very often centered on exactly this room, ducking beneath the hanging bundles, learning each one first by scent alone, long before she learned any of their names. We turn now, gently, to the children of the village and the particular tenderness with which she treated their smaller, more frightening illnesses. Nothing tested a wise woman's skill quite so directly as a sick child, and nothing built her reputation more quickly, in either direction, than how well she managed the ordinary troubles of infancy. Teething, colic, worms, and the sudden frights that could seize a small child in the night were all common enough that she likely dealt with several such cases in any given month, and mothers watched closely and remembered clearly whichever woman had eased their own child's suffering most gently. A wise woman known for a particularly gentle way with frightened children often found this single reputation, more than any other single skill, carrying her name furthest beyond her own village. Since anxious parents will travel a very long way indeed for someone they trust completely with the smallest and most vulnerable member of their household. Let us turn now to teething and the small remedies kept for a fretful infant's sore gums. A little honey, sometimes mixed with a drop of chamomile infusion, was rubbed gently onto an infant's gums to soothe the ache of an emerging tooth. In some regions, a small piece of licorice root or a clean, smooth stone was given for the child to chew against directly, the light pressure itself offering some relief. Wise women also commonly advised mothers on the general pattern of teething, which teeth tended to come first and roughly when, offering the kind of calm, experienced reassurance that mattered nearly as much to an anxious young mother as any herb in the basket. This reassurance, offered again and again to first-time mothers who had never before watched an infant through this particular ordeal, was itself a genuine and valuable service, calming a household's fear as effectively as any remedy calmed the child's sore gums. We turn now to colic and the long, difficult nights it could bring to a household. For the gripping stomach pain of infant colic, fennel and dill both held long and trusted reputations, brewed into a very weak tea and given in small, frequent sips, or in some households passed to the infant indirectly through the nursing mother's own diet. Caraway water, similarly gentle, appears repeatedly in records for exactly this trouble. A wise woman attending a colicky infant often stayed through the worst of the night alongside the exhausted parents, less because her remedies worked instantly, though they sometimes eased things a little, than because her calm, practiced presence made an unbearable night feel, if only slightly, more bearable. Several later accounts, collected from villagers recalling their own grandmothers, describe the wise woman simply walking the floor with a colicky infant for hours at a time, humming some old, wordless tune, a small act of ordinary endurance that no herb or charm could have replaced. Let us turn now to worms, a common and unpleasant trouble among village children. Wormwood, true to its name, and tansy, taken in careful, very small doses, were the most widely recorded remedies for intestinal worms in children across medieval Europe. Both plants were genuinely effective against certain parasites, though also genuinely dangerous in excess, which made the wise woman's careful sense of dosage, learned entirely through observation and experience rather than any written pharmacology, one of the quiet skills that most directly protected the children in her care. Garlic, eaten raw or worn as a small clove sewn into clothing near the stomach, was a gentler and more widely trusted addition to the same treatment. Because the margin between a helpful and a harmful dose of wormwood or tansy was so narrow, this was one of the treatments a young apprentice was allowed to prepare only under very close supervision, long after she had already been trusted with a great many gentler remedies on her own. We turn now to the frights and sudden terrors that could seize a small child, sometimes for no cause a parent could name. When a child woke screaming from what seemed an ordinary dream, or fell suddenly silent and fearful after a loud noise or a fall, the wise woman was often called to help settle what many households described as a fright that had lodged in the child. Her response combined the practical and the reassuring in roughly equal measure. A warm bath scented with lavender or chamomile, a quiet spoken blessing over the child's forehead, and calm, patient company through whatever remained of the disturbed night. Whatever the true medical cause behind these episodes, which modern understanding might describe very differently, her steady presence clearly helped, and village memory remembered her for it. More than one later account describes a wise woman simply sitting beside a frightened child's bed until dawn, saying very little, her presence alone apparently enough to let the child finally settle into a proper, easy sleep. Let us turn now to wounds, bones, and burns, the everyday injuries of a hard-working medieval life. In a world where nearly every task involved a blade, a fire, a heavy animal, or uneven ground underfoot, injury was a constant and expected part of village life, and the wise woman's skill in treating it, quickly and without complication, was tested almost daily. She set the framework other village figures, the smith, the miller, the farmer, relied on entirely. Since a serious cut or a broken limb left untreated for even a day could turn from an ordinary accident into a genuine threat to life. Every household in the village likely had, at one time or another, needed her for exactly this kind of everyday injury, which meant her skill here, more than in almost any other part of her trade, was witnessed and judged directly by nearly everyone she lived among. We turn now to the cleaning and dressing of an ordinary cut. A fresh wound was first washed, often with a vinegar or wine-based solution that, whether the wise woman understood the exact reason or not, genuinely helped reduce the risk of infection taking hold. Yarrow, sometimes called soldier's woundwort for exactly this reason, was packed directly against a bleeding cut to help slow the flow of blood, and a clean linen bandage, boiled beforehand where possible, was bound over the top. Honey, as already noted, was often added beneath the bandage on more serious wounds, and the whole dressing was checked and changed daily until the wound had visibly begun to close. The careful, unhurried way a skilled wise woman cleaned and bound even a very ordinary cut, taking real time over something a less patient hand might rush, was frequently remembered by her neighbors as one of the clearest signs of her particular competence. Let us turn now to the setting of a broken bone, one of the most demanding tasks a wise woman undertook. Bone setting required real physical strength alongside careful knowledge, and many wise women developed a genuine specialty in it, sometimes becoming known specifically as the bone setter of their district, rather than simply the wise woman, a distinct enough skill to earn its own separate reputation. The limb was pulled gently but firmly straight, the two ends of the broken bone brought back into alignment by careful feel, and then bound tightly, often with a comfrey paste beneath the linen wrapping that would harden as it dried into something close to a modern cast. The patient was then kept as still as circumstances allowed for several weeks, the wise woman returning periodically to check that the bone was knitting straight. Some bone-setting families, the skill passed down deliberately across several generations of women in a single line, became known well beyond their own parish, and a serious break was sometimes worth a considerable journey if it meant reaching a healer with exactly this specialized reputation. We turn now to burns, among the most common injuries in any household built around an open hearth. For an ordinary burn from the cooking fire, cool water was applied first and immediately, a piece of practical wisdom that has changed remarkably little in the centuries since. House leek, split open and pressed directly against the burn, and the cooling, soothing gel found inside certain succulent leaves were widely used across the growing season, while calendula salve, kept prepared and ready through the winter months when fresh house leek was harder to find, served the same purpose year-round. More serious burns, which could and did happen around open hearths and hot ovens, called on the wise woman's full skill, since a badly infected burn was, before the age of antiseptics, a genuinely dangerous injury. Because burns were so common, and so often involved young children reaching too close to a cooking fire, a wise woman kept her salve for exactly this purpose, especially well stocked through the coldest months. When the hearth burned longest and hottest and small, curious hands strayed nearest to it. Let us turn now, to close this part of our evening, to the deep, dull ache of the joints and the remedies kept for the long-term suffering of rheumatism and old age. Rheumatism and the general stiffening pain of age were treated less with any single dramatic cure than with steady, ongoing care, since the wise woman understood, from long observation, that such pains rarely disappeared entirely and instead had to be managed patiently across the years. Warm compresses of comfrey or willow bark, the latter containing the same compound that would later be refined into modern aspirin, eased the worst of the pain, while a gentle, Warming liniment of rosemary steeped in oil was rubbed into stiff joints on the coldest mornings. Many an elderly villager owed their continued mobility and a good deal of their daily comfort to a wise woman's quiet, unglamorous, and entirely unremarked attentions, offered week after week without any expectation of a cure, only of steady relief. This kind of long, patient, unglamorous care, given faithfully to the same aching shoulder or stiffened knee across years rather than weeks, rarely appears in any dramatic account of her work, and yet it likely represented, added up across a whole career, more of her actual time and effort than almost any single remarkable cure she was ever remembered for. Let us turn now, for a little while, away from any single herb or remedy, and simply follow her through the shape of one ordinary working day. It is easy, moving fact by fact through her many skills, as we have done tonight, to lose the simple, human rhythm of her actual daily life. Let us slow down for a moment and walk through a single day alongside her, from the grey hour before dawn to the last banked coals of night, and let that unhurried walking be its own kind of rest. We turn now to the very first hour of her day, well before the rest of her household stirred. Her day very often began in darkness, rising quietly while the rest of the household still slept, to walk the hedgerow in the cool grey hour we described earlier, gathering whatever the season and the moon's phase called for while the dew still lay heavy on the leaf. This quiet, solitary hour, belonging to no one but herself, was by several later accounts one of the few times in her whole day she was not, in some sense, working directly for someone else. And there is reason to think she treasured it for exactly that reason. Let us turn now to the mid-morning hours and the steady round of household work that filled them. Once the gathering was done and her own family fed, the middle of her morning was typically given over to the ordinary maintenance of her trade, sorting and hanging whatever had been gathered that dawn, checking the drying loft for anything ready to be brought down and stored, grinding a fresh batch of a frequently needed remedy in the worn stone mortar kept always close at hand. This unglamorous, repetitive labor, rarely mentioned in any dramatic account of her life, likely occupied more of her actual time than any single dramatic birth or bone setting ever did. We turn now to the calls that could arrive at any hour, and how completely they reshaped whatever else her day had planned. A knock at the door, whether from a frightened father summoning her to a difficult labor, or a neighbor's child sent running for help with a sudden fever, took immediate precedence over anything else she had been doing. The mortar set down mid-grind, the half-sorted herbs left exactly where they lay. This constant readiness to drop everything at a moment's notice was simply an accepted, unremarkable part of her trade, and her whole household likely learned, from a very young age, to expect these sudden departures as an ordinary feature of daily life. Let us turn now to the afternoon hours, when her garden itself most often claimed her attention. If no call came to pull her away, her afternoons were frequently spent directly in the dooryard garden we described so warmly at the start of tonight, weeding, watering, dividing an overcrowded clump of chamomile, or thinning a bed of calendula grown too thick for its own good. This was not idle gardening for pleasure alone, though there was very likely real pleasure in it, but careful, purposeful maintenance of what amounted to her entire working stock, tended with the same seriousness a modern shopkeeper might bring to restocking her shelves. We turn now to the evening meal, and the quiet way her medical eye extended even into her own family's supper. As we discussed earlier this evening, the pottage pot simmering through the afternoon was very often adjusted according to who in her own household needed what, and the evening meal itself, eaten together as the light faded, gave her a chance to notice quietly which of her own family seemed tired or pale or slower than usual to finish their bowl, small observations that might shape what she prepared for them. Without any announcement, over the days that followed, let us turn now to the last hour before sleep and the quiet stock-taking that closed most of her ordinary days. Before finally settling for the night, many wise women kept a habit of a last quiet check through their basket and their shelves, restocking whatever had been used that day, making sure the candle stub and clean binding cloth were replaced, so that whatever call might come in the night would find her ready without delay. This small nightly ritual, repeated without fail across thousands of ordinary evenings, was itself a quiet act of care extended toward neighbors who had not yet even fallen ill. We turn now to the interrupted nights, and how often her sleep itself was simply set aside for someone else's greater need. Given how frequently births and sudden fevers arrived in the deep hours of the night, a wise woman's own sleep was, across her whole working life, a far less certain thing than her neighbor's likely was, punctuated regularly by an urgent knock that might carry her from her own bed out into a cold, dark lane before the household's rooster had even begun to stir. It is worth pausing on this simple fact, tucked as it is near the very end of our evening together, that the woman who did so much to ease other people's rest so often, quite literally, went without her own. Let us turn now to the rare, quiet evenings when no call came at all, and she was simply, briefly, left to herself. On the evenings when illness and birth happened, by good fortune, to leave her undisturbed, she might sit a little longer by her own fire, mend a torn cloth, or simply rest her hands, worn rough from decades of grinding root and stripping bark, in her own lap for an hour with nothing at all required of them. These quiet, uneventful evenings, unremarkable enough that almost no record thought to mention them specifically, were very likely treasured all the more for how rarely they came. We turn now to the company she kept in these rare, quiet hours, when her own household gathered simply to be together. A wise woman's own children or apprentice, on an undisturbed evening, might gather close around the same fire that had warmed so many strangers' remedies that day, and it is not hard to imagine some of her own most treasured teaching happening in exactly these unplanned, unhurried hours, a story told, a small skill demonstrated almost in passing, absorbed by a watching daughter or niece long before any formal lesson was ever intended. Let us turn now, to close this quiet walk through her ordinary day, to the very last thing she likely did each night, however late the hour had grown. Whatever the day had asked of her, however many calls had pulled her from her own bed, however tired her hands had grown from the grinding and the gathering and the binding of wounds, she banked her own fire carefully each night before finally lying down, the same small, patient, practical care she gave to every remedy and every patient extended, at the very last, to her own quiet hearth, ready to be coaxed back to life at whatever hour the next knock at her door might come. Let us pause here a moment, Before we go on, and simply sit in the quiet of the cottage a little longer, the fire has burned down to a soft orange bed of coals. Somewhere outside, an owl calls once and is answered farther off by another. If your eyes have already grown heavy, that is exactly as it should be. There is no part of this that requires you to stay awake for all of it. Let the rest come and go as it pleases, and we will simply keep speaking, low and steady, for as long as you need us to. Outside the small window, the last of the day's light has gone entirely now, and the village beyond the wise woman's garden has settled into its own quiet. A dog barks once half-heartedly, somewhere down the lane, and then falls silent again. This is the hour she liked best, by most accounts, the brief calm before whatever the night might still ask of her. We turn now to fevers and to contagion, the great, recurring fear of the medieval village, and the long nights the wise woman spent standing between her neighbors and it. Illness that spread from person to person. Whether the ordinary seasonal ague that swept through a parish most winters, or the far graver outbreaks of plague that reappeared again and again across the medieval centuries, placed enormous weight on the wise woman's shoulders. She was, in the great majority of villages, the first and often the only person consulted when a fever began to climb, and her judgment, whether to treat quietly at home or to warn a household to isolate itself from its neighbors, could genuinely shape how far an illness spread through a community that had no other defense against it. This weight of responsibility, carried quietly and without any formal recognition, sat very differently on her shoulders than it would on a modern doctor's. She had no laboratory, no way of confirming what illness she faced beyond her own accumulated experience. And yet the decisions she made in those first uncertain hours mattered every bit as much. Let us turn now to the ordinary ague, the recurring feverish chill that troubled so much of medieval Europe. What medieval records call the ague, likely encompassing malaria in the wetter, marshier regions, and a range of other recurring fevers elsewhere, was treated with a combination of warming herbs, willow bark for the fever itself, and careful nursing through the shivering and sweating stages that could repeat, with grim regularity, every second or third day for weeks at a time. Feverfew and elderflower both appear repeatedly in the record for this trouble, brewed together into a tea, given warm through the worst of the chill. A wise woman attending a household through a bad bout of ague might visit daily for the better part of a month, her steady presence as much a part of the treatment as anything in her basket. In the fen country and other low, marshy regions where the ague returned most reliably every summer, a wise woman's whole yearly rhythm bent around the illness. Her drying loft stocked well in advance with exactly the herbs she knew the coming season would demand of her. We turn now to plague, the deepest fear of the medieval world, and to the herbs believed to hold it at bay. When plague reached a region, the wise woman's role shifted from ordinary healing towards something closer to prevention and protection. Since medieval medicine, lacking any true understanding of contagion, focused heavily on purifying the air itself, rue, juniper, and wormwood were burned together in sick rooms and sometimes carried through the streets in the belief that their strong scent could drive off the corrupted air thought to carry the disease. Pomanders, small dried oranges studded thickly with cloves, were carried and sniffed for the same reason, a custom that persisted for centuries after plague itself had largely receded from most of Europe, worn simply from habit and a lingering, half-remembered caution. Many wise women, moving constantly among the sick during a plague outbreak in ways town physicians of means often avoided, paid a heavy price for their courage, and parish death records from plague years show healer after healer among the dead, their names simply vanishing from the record the following season. Let us turn now to the isolation of the sick and the wise woman's uncomfortable role in enforcing it. In villages struck by a serious outbreak, the wise woman was often the one who advised a household to shut its doors, to mark itself apart from its neighbors, and to accept food left at a safe distance rather than delivered by hand. This was rarely a comfortable role for her to occupy. It required her to weigh the safety of the wider village against the immediate suffering of the family in front of her, and it sometimes meant she herself risked exposure by continuing to visit the isolated household at all, carrying food, checking on the sick, and offering what comfort she could from a careful distance. This balancing act, protecting the many while never quite abandoning the few, asked something of her that no formal training could have prepared her for. And it is easy to imagine the quiet, private toll it must have taken across a long working life spent making exactly these decisions. We turn now to the smallpox, and the pox marks it left behind on those who survived it. Smallpox, widespread and greatly feared across the whole of medieval and early modern Europe, was treated by the wise woman largely through careful nursing rather than any cure, since none existed. She kept the sick room dim, since bright light was believed, with some genuine basis, to worsen the eye damage the illness could cause, and applied cooling washes of elderflower or rosewater to ease the discomfort of the characteristic rash. Survivors, marked afterward with the pitted scars the illness commonly left, were understood across most of Europe to be permanently immune, a piece of folk observation that later fed directly into the earliest formal experiments with inoculation. Centuries before the disease's true cause was understood, a wise woman who had herself survived smallpox in childhood, her own skin marked with the telltale scars, could nurse the sick fearlessly, knowing from her own observation and everyone else's that she would not fall ill a second time, a small, hard-won advantage in an otherwise frightening trade. Let us turn now to the sweating sickness, a mysterious and swiftly fatal fever that appeared periodically in England across the later medieval and early modern period. Unlike the slower fevers of ordinary illness, the sweating sickness struck with alarming speed, sometimes killing within a single day of the first symptoms appearing. And wise women who lived through its periodic outbreaks developed a particular, urgent set of responses, keeping the sufferer warm but never overheated, offering small, frequent sips of a cooling herbal drink, and watching closely through the crisis, since survival or death was often decided within hours rather than days. Its cause remains debated by historians even today, but the careful, exhausted vigilance of the women who nursed through its outbreaks is recorded again and again in the surviving accounts. Because the illness moved so quickly, a wise woman summoned for the sweating sickness rarely left the sufferer's bedside at all until the crisis had passed one way or the other, sometimes going an entire day and night without proper rest herself. We turn now to the almanac she kept, not on paper but in memory, tracking the moon and the turning of the season. Very few wise women owned a written almanac in the modern sense, yet nearly all of them carried something remarkably similar in their heads: a detailed working knowledge of the moon's phase, the turning of the season, and the long calendar of saints' days that structured the medieval year. This mental almanac governed a great deal of her practice, from when to plant and gather her herbs, to when certain treatments were thought most likely to succeed, and losing track of it, in a world without easy access to a written calendar, would have left her working blind through much of her most important seasonal work. This entirely memorized calendar, carried year after year without a single written page to check against, represents one of the quieter feats of the wise woman's whole practice, an accumulated body of dates and correspondences that a modern listener, reliant on printed calendars and phone reminders, might struggle even to imagine holding entirely in the mind. Let us turn now to the saints' days that marked the turning points of her working year. Certain feast days served as reliable seasonal markers for a wise woman's work, regardless of how the weather that particular year happened to behave. Candlemas, in early February, marked roughly the midpoint of winter and the traditional time to check remaining stores of dried herb against what remained of the cold season ahead. Lady Day, in late March, marked the true beginning of the agricultural year in much of England, and the customary date on which many herbs were first sown. Michaelmas, in late September, marked harvest's end and the beginning of preparation for winter, a natural point to take full stock of the drying loft and see what still needed gathering before the frost came. These fixed points in the year gave her a steady structure to build her work around, much as the seasons themselves did, and villagers who could not always trust an uncertain harvest to arrive exactly on time could at least trust that the wise woman's own rhythms, tied to the church calendar rather than the weather, would arrive precisely when expected. We turn now to the phases of the moon and the careful attention she paid to each one beyond simple gathering. Beyond timing her harvest, many wise women also timed certain treatments themselves by the moon's phase, believing, in keeping with the wider medical theory of the period, that the moon exerted a real pull on the body's fluids much as it pulled the tides. Bleeding, a common medical treatment of the era, though one the wise woman herself performed less often than a formally trained physician, was in several regions specifically avoided during the full moon, when the body's blood was thought to rise closest to the surface and flow most freely. Purging treatments, by contrast, were sometimes preferred during the waning moon, on the belief that the body's own natural downward and outward movements would be assisted by the moon's corresponding pull. A wise woman's whole month in this way had its own quiet internal shape. Certain treatments held back for a few days until the moon reached the right phase. Others hurried forward while conditions were judged favorable, a rhythm invisible to anyone who did not share her particular way of reading the sky. Let us turn now to the 12 days of Christmas and the quieter, more restful pause they brought to her working year. The stretch of days between Christmas and Epiphany, called the 12 days across much of medieval Europe, brought one of the few genuine pauses in the wise woman's otherwise unbroken working calendar. Custom in many regions discouraged spinning, certain kinds of heavy labor, and even some forms of gathering during this stretch. And while childbirth and illness naturally paid no attention to any calendar. The general slowing of village life gave her, more than at almost any other point in the year, a little space to rest, mend her tools, and take stock of the coming year's needs. It is a small, gentle thing to imagine, this one quiet stretch of midwinter rest granted to a woman who otherwise answered every knock at her door, regardless of the hour or the weather. A brief and well-earned pause before the demands of the new year began again in earnest. We turn now to weather signs and the careful, practical way she read the sky and the behavior of animals around her. Long before any written forecast existed, the wise woman relied on a detailed, orally transmitted set of weather signs to plan her gathering and her garden work. A particular reddening of the evening sky, the low, urgent flight of swallows before a storm, the tight closing of certain flowers ahead of rain, all of these were read and trusted as reliably as any modern forecast, and getting them wrong could mean a whole harvest of herb left out and ruined by an unexpected downpour. Her accuracy, built from decades of careful, attentive watching, often exceeded that of anyone else in the village. Farmers as well as fellow healers came to trust her particular skill at reading the coming weather, and it was not unusual for a whole village's harvest timing to be quietly influenced by whatever the wise woman had noticed in the swallow's flight or the color of that evening's sky. Let us turn now, more quietly still, to the small fortune-telling and dream-reading that sat alongside her medical work, welcomed by some neighbors and eyed with real suspicion by others. Beyond illness and birth, villagers also came to the wise woman with questions that had nothing directly to do with the body, wondering about a journey's safety, a harvest's likely success, or the true meaning of a troubling dream. She answered these questions using a set of small, informal divinatory practices that varied enormously by region, and this part of her work, more than almost any other, would later be seized upon and twisted by her accusers, though in her own community it was, for a very long time, simply one more quiet service among many. Villagers themselves rarely drew any sharp line between this part of her work and her medical remedies, seeking her guidance on a worrying dream with much the same easy trust they brought to a fever or a sprained wrist, evidence of how completely her authority extended across every corner of village life. We turn now to the reading of tea leaves and the patterns left in a cooling cup. Reading the shapes left by settled tea leaves or herb dregs in the bottom of a cup was a widespread and largely light-hearted practice across much of Europe, taken seriously by some and treated as gentle amusement by others, often performed at the end of an ordinary visit once the medical business of the day was already finished. A wise woman skilled at this reading might describe a shape as a ship, suggesting travel, or a ring, suggesting an approaching marriage, offering her interpretation with the same easy confidence she brought to naming an unfamiliar plant. These small readings, offered warmly and often with a knowing smile, gave a visit to the wise woman a lighter, more sociable ending than the medical business alone might have suggested, a friendly small ritual that neighbors looked forward to almost as much as the remedy itself. Let us turn now to dream reading and the careful attention paid to what a troubled sleeper had seen in the night. Dreams were taken seriously across nearly the whole of medieval society, not only by the wise woman, and she was frequently asked to interpret a particularly vivid or troubling one, drawing on a body of traditional dream symbolism passed down much like her herbal knowledge. Dreaming of clear water was widely read as a good sign, while dreaming of losing teeth was almost universally read as a warning of loss or worry to come. Her interpretations offered comfort as often as caution, a way of giving shape and meaning to the formless anxiety a strange dream could leave behind in the morning. A villager troubled by a recurring nightmare might visit her several times over a season, and her patient, consistent interpretation across those visits often did more to ease the underlying worry than any single reading could have on its own. We turn now to the small charms of everyday fortune, carried for luck rather than for any specific illness. Not every charm the wise woman prepared addressed sickness directly. Small bundles of herbs, sometimes combined with a coin or a smooth stone, were prepared for travelers setting out on a long or uncertain journey, for young couples about to marry, and for households moving into a new home. These charms occupied a comfortable, everyday place in village life, exchanged as casually as a loaf of bread or a jar of preserve, evidence of how thoroughly her small blessings were woven into the ordinary rhythm of her neighbors' lives. A traveler carrying one of her small charms into a distant town sometimes found, on returning safely months later, that the little bundle had become something of a treasured keepsake, kept long after its original purpose was served. A small physical memory of home carried the whole way and back again. Let us turn now to the reading of a palm, practiced by some wise women and firmly avoided by others as a step too far. Palmistry, the reading of the lines of the hand, appears in the record more unevenly than tea leaf or dream reading, embraced enthusiastically by some wise women as simply another small comfort to offer a worried neighbor, and avoided carefully by others who judged it too close to the kind of fortune-telling that could draw dangerous attention from the church. This uneven pattern tells us something important about the wise woman's world more broadly. She was rarely operating from a single fixed rulebook. Each woman judged based on her own community and her own sense of what was safely tolerated, exactly how far her small, informal magic could extend before it became a genuine risk to her. A cautious wise woman in a parish with a particularly strict priest might quietly set palmistry aside altogether, while her counterpart 2 villages over, under a more easygoing clergyman, practiced it openly and without any apparent concern at all. We turn now to the counting of crows and the reading of birds, an old and widespread form of everyday omen. The number and behavior of certain birds, crows and magpies most commonly, were widely read as signs of coming fortune. A rhyme still faintly remembered in parts of the English countryside, today counting 1 for sorrow and 2 for joy through a longer, older list. A wise woman was sometimes asked simply to confirm what a worried neighbor had already half decided a particular sighting meant. Her role here less about specialized knowledge than about the quiet authority her position had earned her, an authority that extended, in the minds of her neighbors, well beyond the strictly medical matters she had first been trusted with. This steady, informal expansion of her authority, from medicine into weather, into dreams, into the meaning of a single crow crossing a lane at dusk, happened so gradually and so naturally across her working life that neither she nor her neighbors likely noticed it occurring at all, until, in time, it had become simply part of who she was to them. Let us turn now to a more practical matter, and one that touched every single visit a wise woman ever made. How, exactly, was she paid? In a world where most of her neighbors had very little coin to spare. Money changed hands less often than a modern listener might expect in the wise woman's line of work. Most villagers in medieval Europe operated within a wider economy of barter and mutual obligation long before coin became the everyday measure of value it is today, and her fees reflected this completely. A birth attended might be paid in a portion of the next season's grain. A wound tended might be repaid with a day's labor in her own garden, mending her fences or turning over her beds ahead of the spring planting. A particularly poor household might offer nothing more than gratitude and the promise of help returned when her own need arose, and this promise was honored with striking consistency across village after village, since a community that treated its healer poorly risked, quite practically, losing her willingness to come quickly the next time she was needed. This whole informal economy of remembered favors and future obligations required a very good memory on the wise woman's part, tracking who owed her what across years rather than days, an accounting kept entirely in her own head and honored, by all accounts, with remarkable consistency on both sides. We turn now to eggs, one of the single most common forms of payment recorded for her work. Eggs appear again and again in the surviving household accounts that mention payment to a wise woman, a small, steady, easily given form of thanks that cost a family little, and yet added up, across dozens of visits through a working year, into a genuinely meaningful part of her household's food supply. A basket left quietly at her door the morning after a difficult birth, sometimes without a word exchanged at all, was itself a kind of language, a way of saying thank you that required no awkward conversation about money between neighbors who would see one another again at market the very next week. Because eggs kept reasonably well and could be traded onward easily if her own household had more than it needed, this particular form of payment suited her circumstances especially well, a small, quiet, endlessly renewable currency that flowed steadily toward her cottage door through every season of the year. Let us turn now to cloth and thread, a second common currency of her trade. Woven cloth, spun thread, or a length of good wool were frequently offered in payment as well, particularly by households whose own work involved weaving or spinning as part of their livelihood. A skilled, wise woman might, over the years, accumulate enough cloth through this kind of payment that she rarely needed to weave for her own household at all, trading instead in a slow, steady exchange of skills, her medicine for someone else's loom work, each side of the trade valuing what the other could not easily provide for themselves. A length of particularly fine cloth, given in gratitude after an especially difficult or frightening birth, sometimes became something closer to a keepsake than an ordinary payment kept aside by the wise woman herself, rather than traded onward, a quiet reminder of one night among the very many she had attended. We turn now to labor itself, given directly rather than converted into any object at all. Perhaps the most common payment of all, particularly among the poorest households, was simply labor, a son or daughter sent to help with the wise woman's own harvest. A neighbor's husband splitting firewood for her through an autumn afternoon. A group of village women gathering to help with her own washing or spinning on a day she had fallen behind. This kind of payment tied the wise woman's welfare directly to the well-being of the whole village around her, since a bad harvest or a hard winter for her neighbors meant, inevitably, a leaner year for her as well, her fortunes rising and falling in step with the community she served. This deep, practical interdependence meant her own comfort and her neighbors' comfort were never really separate matters, and it likely explains a great deal of the genuine, mutual loyalty that so many surviving village records describe between a long-serving wise woman and the community she had spent a lifetime tending. Let us turn now to the wealthier households she occasionally served, and the different terms on which they dealt with her. While her ordinary trade ran on barter and mutual obligation, a wise woman known for particular skill in bone setting or in midwifery especially, sometimes found her services sought by wealthier families, even minor gentry, willing to pay in actual coin for her attendance. These arrangements could shift her standing considerably, and a woman who had once been paid in eggs and firewood might, later in her career, find herself able to purchase land or leave a small dowry to a daughter, evidence of a professional respect that crossed, if only occasionally, the ordinary boundaries of village class. Even in these wealthier households, though she was rarely treated quite as an equal, called to a side door rather than the front, and paid promptly but without much of the warmth she likely received from her poorer, more ordinary neighbors down the lane. We turn now to the apprentice she herself might train, and the quiet system of succession this represented. As a wise woman aged, she typically began training a successor well before her own working days ended, most often a daughter or niece, though sometimes simply a promising young woman from the village with a genuine aptitude for the work. This apprentice accompanied her on visits for years, gradually taking on more responsibility, until the older woman's death or retirement passed the role and the trust of the village along with it, smoothly to the next generation. This system meant that a single line of practical knowledge could run unbroken through a single parish for a century or more, each woman adding her own small refinements to what she had been taught. Watching an old wise woman finally hand over her basket to a trusted apprentice, after years of careful, gradual training, must have felt to the whole village like the closing of one long chapter, and the quiet, confident opening of another, the work itself continuing even as the particular hands doing it changed. Let us turn now to her tools, gathered and mended across an entire working lifetime. Beyond the basket she carried on her rounds, a wise woman's cottage typically held a modest but carefully maintained set of tools built up slowly across decades, a large mortar and pestle worn smooth with use, several clay or glass vessels for storing tinctures and infusions, a set of clean cloths kept specifically for dressing wounds, and a collection of small scales or measures for judging quantities of the more potent and dangerous herbs. These tools were valuable enough and specific enough to her trade that they were sometimes named individually in wills, passed down deliberately to whichever daughter or apprentice was expected to carry the work forward. A mortar and pestle handed down across 3 or 4 generations of the same family carried, by the time it reached its final owner, a weight of memory well beyond its plain physical worth, ground smooth by hands that had all, in their turn, done exactly the same quiet work. We turn now to her reputation beyond her own village, and how word of a particularly gifted wise woman could travel. A wise woman known for real skill, particularly in difficult births or complicated bone setting, rarely remained known only within her own parish for long. Word travelled along the same roads that carried grain to market and news from one village to the next. And a family facing a particularly frightening complication might send a rider considerable distance to fetch a wise woman whose reputation had reached them, bypassing a nearer but less trusted healer entirely. Some women became known across an entire region in this way, their names remembered in the records of parishes many miles from where they actually lived. Being fetched to a distant village for a difficult case meant leaving her own household and her own patients for days at a time, a real sacrifice that speaks to how seriously she took her reputation and how far that reputation, once earned, could genuinely carry. Let us turn now to the rivalries that could arise between wise women serving neighboring villages, where two skilled wise women worked within reasonable traveling distance of one another. A certain quiet rivalry sometimes developed, each aware of the other's reputation and each, in her own way, protective of the trust her own community placed in her. Surviving records occasionally hint at these tensions. A family choosing to send for the woman from the next village over rather than their own local healer, a slight that was not always taken gracefully. For the most part, though, the demands of the work left little room for lasting conflict. There was, in most seasons, more illness and more need than any single woman could fully answer alone. Where real friction did arise, it was most often over exactly this kind of perceived slight, one village's healer feeling passed over in favor of another, rather than any deeper disagreement about method or medicine. A very human, very ordinary kind of professional jealousy playing out quietly at the edges of an otherwise cooperative trade. We turn now to the male practitioners she sometimes worked alongside, and the uneasy, shifting relationship between them. As formal medicine slowly professionalized across the later medieval period, town-based physicians and barber surgeons increasingly found themselves working, however reluctantly, within the same rural landscape as the village wise woman, and the relationship between them varied enormously depending on the individual people and the particular decade. Some physicians genuinely valued a skilled wise woman's practical knowledge and referred difficult cases to her rather than attempting a delivery or a bone setting themselves. Others viewed her with open suspicion, resentful of the trust and business she commanded among people who could rarely afford their own considerably higher fees, a resentment that would, in later centuries, feed directly into some of the darker chapters of her story. This uneven, shifting relationship, warm collaboration in one parish and open hostility in the next, meant a wise woman's professional life could look very different depending simply on which physician happened to have settled in the nearest market town. Let us turn now to the licensing disputes that began to appear as towns grew and formal medical guilds took shape. In some of the larger towns of later medieval Europe, formal medical guilds began attempting to restrict who could legally practice healing within their walls, a development that placed increasing pressure on wise women working at the edges of town life, even as it left the deep countryside largely untouched. A handful of surviving court records describe formally trained physicians bringing complaints against local wise women for practicing without a license, complaints that met with mixed success, since town councils often recognized, even as they upheld the letter of the guild's rules, that the wise woman in question had served the town's poorer residents faithfully for years in ways the guild's own members had never troubled themselves to do. These early licensing disputes, small and scattered as they were, mark the quiet beginning of a much longer and much darker process, the slow narrowing of the space in which a woman like her could practice freely, a process that would unfold gradually across the centuries that followed. Let us turn now, more slowly and more carefully than before, to the harder part of her story, the long and uneven line she walked between being loved as a healer and feared as something else entirely. It is worth saying plainly, before we go any further, that for most of her long history, across most of medieval Europe, the wise woman was simply trusted and valued exactly as we have described her through this whole evening. The darker chapter we are about to enter belongs mostly to a later period than many listeners expect, the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, rather than the high medieval centuries in which so much of her ordinary practice had already taken shape. Her story did not begin in fear. It only, in certain places and certain decades, came to end there. This is an important distinction, and one modern retellings sometimes blur. The wise woman of the 12th or 13th century, tending her dooryard garden and attending her neighbors' births, generally did so in a climate of ordinary, unremarkable trust. It was the later centuries, under particular pressures we will come to shortly, that reshaped how her very same skills could be seen. We turn now to the uncomfortable truth that the line between healer and witch was never really fixed at all. The same knowledge that let a wise woman ease a fever or bring down a swelling could, described differently, be made to sound like the working of harm rather than help. A remedy that failed, a birth that ended badly despite her best effort, an illness that simply ran its natural course toward death regardless of any treatment, could all be reinterpreted, after the fact and by frightened or grieving neighbors, as evidence of malice rather than the ordinary limits of medieval medicine. The very same herbs that filled her dooryard garden, capable in the wrong hand or the wrong dose of harming as easily as healing, made this reinterpretation disturbingly easy to construct. This double edge, present in her knowledge from the very beginning, meant her position in the village had always carried a hidden fragility, invisible in ordinary times and slowly, quietly visible whenever fear or grief needed somewhere to land. Let us turn now to the treatises written, mostly by clergymen, that first began setting this fear down in a formal and systematic way. Texts such as the Malleus Maleficarum, published in the later 15th century, explicitly singled out cunning women and folk healers as a category of particular concern, arguing that their evident skill, especially in matters of health and childbirth, made them more rather than less suspect. This kind of formal, written suspicion, circulating among educated clergy and magistrates who had never themselves depended on a village healer's practical skill, gave a new and dangerous shape to fears that had previously remained scattered, local, and largely informal. Before such treatises existed, an accusation of harmful magic had generally stayed a private local matter, resolved or forgotten within a single village. Afterward, it increasingly had somewhere formal to go, a legal and theological framework ready, and waiting to receive it. We turn now to the failed harvest and the sick livestock, and how readily either could be laid unfairly at a wise woman's door. When a season turned bad, crops failing or animals sickening for reasons no one in the village could otherwise explain, suspicion sometimes turned toward whoever in the community was already understood to hold unusual power over health and growth, and the wise woman, by the very nature of her trade, fit this description more readily than almost anyone else nearby. A poor harvest that in an earlier century might have been blamed simply on weather or misfortune could, in a more fearful decade, be quietly laid instead at the door of the woman who tended the hedgerow herbs and knew, better than anyone, which plants could harm as easily as heal. This shift from blaming misfortune on chance to blaming it on a particular neighbor tended to happen most readily in periods of genuine hardship, when a frightened community searched, understandably but tragically, for some explanation it could act against. Let us turn now to the soured friendship, and how an ordinary falling out between neighbors could, in the worst cases, curdle slowly into an accusation. A surprising number of surviving accusation records begin not with any sudden dramatic event, but with a slow, ordinary breakdown in an existing relationship, a refused loan, an unpaid debt, a dispute over land or a shared well, soaring gradually over months or years, until one party's later misfortune was blamed on the other's supposed ill will, because the wise woman held real, visible power within her community. Disputes involving her carried an added weight that an ordinary quarrel between two farmers did not, her considerable local authority becoming, in the worst circumstances, a liability rather than a protection. Historians studying these records closely have found that accusers and accused had very often known each other for years, sometimes decades, and that the accusation frequently traced back to a single, specific, remembered grievance rather than any sudden discovery of wrongdoing. We turn now to who, specifically, tended to be accused, and the uncomfortable pattern this reveals. Across the surviving trial records of early modern Europe, certain characteristics recur with striking, uncomfortable regularity among the accused. Older women, often widowed, often living alone or with only modest means, and often possessing exactly the kind of specialized herbal or medical knowledge we have spent this whole evening describing, appear disproportionately in the record. A woman who had outlived her husband, who depended partly on her healing trade for her own survival, and who had, across a long working life, inevitably accumulated a few disappointed or resentful former patients, occupied a position of genuine vulnerability that a younger, better connected woman did not. This pattern, visible clearly across thousands of surviving cases studied by later historians, tells us something sobering about who bore the greatest cost when a community's fear finally found somewhere to land. Let us turn now to the garden itself, and how the very plants we have spent so much of tonight describing could, in the worst circumstances, become evidence against her. Certain plants long kept in the wise woman's garden for entirely ordinary medicinal purposes, wormwood, henbane, the nightshade family more broadly, carried a double reputation by the later medieval and early modern period, valued as medicine and feared as poison in equal measure. A garden that had, for decades, simply supplied her ordinary trade could, described differently before a frightened magistrate, be made to sound like evidence of darker intent. The very same bed of herbs, read entirely differently depending on who was doing the reading and why. This meant a wise woman's own garden. The quiet, careful, lifelong work we described so warmly earlier tonight occasionally became, in the cruelest irony of her whole story, a piece of evidence turned against her. We turn now to the strange logic by which her very success could be used against her. Perhaps the most painful irony of this whole period concerned skill itself. A wise woman whose remedies worked unusually well, whose reputation for successful healing had spread furthest, sometimes drew exactly the kind of suspicious attention that a less capable healer avoided entirely, her evident skill reinterpreted as evidence of some unnatural aid, a familiar spirit or a pact, rather than simple decades of hard-won, ordinary competence. The very qualities that made her most valuable to her community in ordinary times could, in a fearful decade, be turned entirely against her. This bitter irony was not lost on later historians studying the pattern, who note that the most skilled and most trusted village healers were, in certain documented cases, precisely the ones eventually named. Let us turn now to the other side of this story, the many trials that ended not in conviction, but in acquittal, defended by the very community she had served. It is important to say clearly that the great majority of formal accusations against village healers across the whole period did not end in conviction at all. Surviving trial records repeatedly show neighbors, sometimes dozens of them, coming forward to testify on an accused wise woman's behalf, describing specific births she had safely attended, specific fevers she had eased, specific children she had nursed back to health, testimony that in many documented cases persuaded a court to dismiss the charges entirely. The same community that could, in its worst fearful moments, turn against her more often in the end, chose to stand by her instead. This pattern of community defense, less dramatic and far less remembered than the trials that ended tragically, deserves to be told every bit as often, since it represents, in its own quiet way, the far more common outcome across the whole of this difficult period. We turn now to the regional differences in how harshly this fear was ultimately acted upon. The intensity of which trials varied enormously across Europe, both by region and by decade, with certain areas, parts of the German lands, Scotland, and French-speaking Switzerland among them, experiencing considerably more severe persecution than others. Southern Europe, and particularly Mediterranean regions, under the reach of certain church courts, generally saw far fewer executions, in part because those courts required a much higher standard of evidence than many secular courts elsewhere demanded. A wise woman's actual risk, in other words, depended enormously on simple geography and the particular legal customs of wherever she happened to live and work. This wide regional variation reminds us that no single, uniform story can capture the whole of her experience across so many different countries and centuries, each community writing its own particular chapter of this same larger history. Let us turn now to the water test, one of the more widely known and widely misunderstood methods used in some regions to examine an accusation. In parts of early modern Europe, an accused woman was sometimes bound and lowered into water on the theory that a guilty party, having renounced her baptism, would be rejected by the water and float, while an innocent one would sink. Even at the time, this method was recognized by many educated observers, including some clergy and magistrates, as deeply unreliable, and several regional courts explicitly rejected it as evidence long before the wider period of trials came to its eventual close. Its use varied enormously by place and by period, far less universal than popular memory of it today generally suggests. Legal historians studying the surviving records note that formal courts, as opposed to informal or mob justice, relied on this particular test far less often than folklore has since remembered, most formal trials turning instead on witness testimony of exactly the kind we described a moment ago. We turn now to the search for a mark, a mole or blemish taken, in some trials, as physical evidence against the accused. Investigators in certain regions searched an accused woman's body for what was called a devil's mark, typically an ordinary mole, birthmark, or scar reinterpreted as a sign of some unnatural pact. Given how common such marks are on any human body, this method of evidence gathering could implicate almost anyone, and its use, like the water test, varied considerably by region and grew more or less common, depending on the particular decade and the particular magistrate overseeing a given case. Later legal historians have pointed to searches of exactly this kind as some of the clearest evidence of how far formal process could drift in the most fearful periods from anything resembling fair or reliable evidence. Let us turn now to the quiet ways some wise women adapted their practice in the more fearful decades to reduce the risk they faced in regions and periods where suspicion ran particularly high. Some wise women deliberately changed how they worked, setting aside the spoken charms and small divinations we described earlier in favor of herbal remedies alone, careful to frame their knowledge in terms that sounded more like ordinary household skill than anything resembling magic. Others declined payment altogether for certain kinds of request, wary of the accusation, common in several trial records, that money exchanged for a charm proved some illicit bargain had taken place. These careful, deliberate adjustments, made quietly and without any fanfare, represent a wise woman's own considered response to a genuinely dangerous climate, adapting her centuries-old trade as best she could to the particular fears of her own difficult moment. We turn now to the licensing of midwives that the Church itself, in certain regions, eventually introduced. Partly in response to these very same anxieties, some regions began requiring midwives to be formally examined and licensed by church or civic authorities, a development that carried a strange double edge. On one hand, it offered a recognized, protected status to women who obtained such a license, a formal seal of approval that could genuinely shield them from accusation. On the other, it excluded a great many skilled and experienced women who, for reasons of poverty, distance, or simple unfamiliarity with the formal examination process, never obtained one, narrowing who could practice safely and openly even as it protected those who did. This licensing process marks, in its own quiet bureaucratic way, an early step in the much longer process by which formal, officially sanctioned medicine would gradually narrow the space available to informal, community-based healers like her. Let us turn now to the slow professionalization of medicine more broadly, and how it gradually reshaped her role, even where no accusation ever touched her directly. Across the 16th and 17th centuries, and accelerating further in the centuries that followed, formally trained, university-educated, and increasingly male-dominated medicine steadily expanded its reach into territory the village-wise woman had long held largely to herself, including, eventually, childbirth itself. Male midwives and later obstetricians gradually displaced her from the birthing room in town after town, a slow, largely peaceful process compared to the trials, but one that nonetheless closed off, over several generations, most of what had once been her clearest and most respected domain. This quieter, more bureaucratic decline ultimately reshaped far more of her traditional role across a much wider area than the trials themselves ever did, even as it has left a far fainter mark on popular memory. Let us turn now, to close this difficult part of our evening gently, to the simple fact that most wise women, across most of her long history, lived out entirely ordinary lives, unpersecuted and well regarded by the neighbors they served. For every dramatic trial that survives in the historical record, there were countless thousands of wise women across medieval and early modern Europe, whose long working lives ended exactly as they had unfolded, in quiet, steady, well-regarded service to their village, remembered afterward with genuine warmth rather than fear. The trials, however important to understand and however real their cost to the women caught up in them, represent a difficult and painful chapter within her much longer story. Not the whole of it. The greater part of her history, spanning far more centuries and far more women than the worst of the persecutions ever touched, was simply this: a woman known, trusted, and quietly relied upon, exactly as we described her at the very start of tonight. Let us breathe out slowly together here, and let that steadier, more ordinary truth settle before we move on to how her story continued. Let us turn now to a handful of these women whose actual names have survived, out of the many hundreds of thousands who did not, and spend a little time with each of them before we return to the wider, nameless pattern of her story. Most of what we have described tonight belongs to no single woman in particular, gathered instead from patterns repeated across countless unnamed lives. It seems right, though, near the close of our evening, to sit for a moment with a few of the individual women whose names did, by whatever accident of record-keeping, survive. We turn now to Trotula of Salerno, whose name we have mentioned once already tonight, and whose writing gives us one of our clearest direct windows into women's medieval medicine. Trotula worked and taught in Salerno, in southern Italy, in the 11th and 12th centuries, at a medical school unusually, though not entirely, open to women. And the body of writing associated with her name covers childbirth, women's health, and cosmetic care in considerable practical detail. Whether every text later attributed to her was written by her alone remains debated among historians, but the collection known as the Trotula circulated widely across medieval Europe for centuries, translated into numerous languages, giving physicians and midwives alike direct access to exactly the kind of women's medical knowledge that so much of our evening has otherwise had to reconstruct indirectly. Her surviving work reads, even now, with a calm, practical confidence that would feel entirely familiar to the village-wise woman we have spent tonight imagining, the same careful attention to dosage, to comfort, to what actually seemed to help. Let us turn now to Hildegard von Bingen once more, and the remarkable range of her surviving writing on plants and healing. Hildegard, the 12th century abbess we have referenced several times tonight, wrote extensively on natural history and medicine alongside her better-known theological and musical work. describing hundreds of plants, animals and stones along with their believed medicinal properties in a text, now generally known as the Physica. Writing from within a religious community, rather than an ordinary village, her circumstances differed considerably from the wise woman we have mostly described tonight, yet her careful, systematic attention to the practical uses of the natural world around her reflects exactly the same kind of patient observation that shaped the ordinary cunning woman's knowledge in villages far from any abbey. Because she could read and write, and because her considerable religious standing protected and preserved her work in ways no ordinary village healer's knowledge ever enjoyed, Hildegard's writing survives today in remarkable, specific detail, a rare, direct voice from a tradition that elsewhere reaches us only in echo. We turn now to Jacoba Felicie, tried in Paris in the early 14th century for practicing medicine without a license, and the surprisingly detailed record her trial has left behind. Jacoba Felicie was brought before the medical faculty of Paris in 1322, accused of practicing medicine without the university training and formal license the faculty required, despite what her own witnesses described as considerable success treating patients other physicians had failed to help. Several of her former patients testified on her behalf, describing specific illnesses she had successfully treated after formally trained physicians had given up. Testimony strikingly similar in shape to the community defenses we described earlier tonight in the context of later witch trials. She was ultimately found guilty of practicing without a license and fined, though the detailed record of her trial preserves an unusually clear picture of exactly the kind of skilled, unlicensed, community-trusted healer we have spent this whole evening describing. Her case, well documented precisely because it unfolded within a formal university court, rather than a small village, gives us a rare, detailed glimpse of the tension between official medical authority and genuine, community-proven healing skill that ran quietly beneath so much of her wider story. Let us turn now, gently, to Agnes Sampson, a Scottish healer whose life ended in one of the earlier and more thoroughly documented witch trials of the 16th century. Agnes Sampson worked as a healer and midwife in East Lothian, in Scotland, known locally for her skill with herbal remedies and her attendance at difficult births, before being drawn into the North Berwick witch trials of the early 1590s, one of the larger and more politically charged episodes of witch persecution in Scottish history. The surviving record of her case, unusually detailed by the standards of the period, shows a woman whose ordinary healing reputation, built across years of genuine service to her community, was ultimately reinterpreted within a much larger and more frightened political moment than any single village dispute could have produced on its own. Her story, sobering as it is, reminds us that the darker chapter we discussed earlier tonight was rarely only a local, personal matter, but was very often entangled with much larger political and religious anxieties, reaching well beyond any single wise woman's own quiet garden and cottage. We turn now to the healers of Iam, the small Derbyshire village whose story, though it belongs to a slightly later period, echoes so much of what we have described tonight. When plague reached the English village of Iam in 1665, the community made the remarkable decision to quarantine itself entirely, refusing to let the illness spread further into the surrounding countryside, a decision that cost a great many villagers their lives. but is credited with sparing the wider region. Local healers and the village rector worked together through the crisis, tending the sick with exactly the kind of herbal knowledge and careful nursing we described earlier in our chapter on fevers and contagion, doing everything within their considerable but ultimately limited power for their neighbors. Though I Am's story is more fully documented than most, precisely because of how extraordinary the village's collective sacrifice was, it stands in for countless smaller, less recorded acts of exactly this same kind of courage, performed by healers in plague-stricken villages across the whole of medieval and early modern Europe. Let us turn now, to close this part of our evening, to the many thousands more whose names we will simply never know at all. For every Trotula, every Hildegard, every woman whose trial or whose extraordinary circumstance happened to leave a documented trace, there were countless thousands more wise women whose entire lives, however long and however faithfully spent in service to their neighbors, left no written record at all beyond, perhaps, a single line in a parish account book, noting a small payment for attending a birth. Their names are gone. Their particular remedies, their particular small kindnesses, the particular sound of their voice, speaking a blessing over a frightened child, all of it has passed beyond any record we can now recover. And yet the pattern they left behind, repeated so consistently across so many villages and so many centuries that we have been able to reconstruct it, fact by quiet fact, across this whole long evening, tells us they were there, all of them, in cottage after cottage, village after village, doing exactly the kind of patient, careful, generous work we have spent tonight trying, however imperfectly, to remember. Let us turn to one or two final small facts before we let this chapter close. Small threads that did not fit neatly anywhere earlier but deserve a place before the night is through. We turn now to the particular way she measured a remedy, long before any standard weight or measure existed to help her. Without scales precise enough for the smallest doses, and often without any scale at all, she measured many of her remedies by simple, repeatable gestures, a pinch between thumb and two fingers, a small handful cupped in one palm, a spoon dipped a certain number of times. These gestures, repeated so many thousands of times across a working life that they became second nature, gave her a real, working precision that no written measurement could easily have improved upon, her own two hands serving, in effect, as the most reliable instrument in her entire basket. Let us turn now to the quiet habit, recorded in a number of regions, of teaching a remedy through rhyme rather than plain instruction. A great deal of her practical knowledge, dosages, gathering times, the order in which ingredients were added to a pot, was preserved and taught through short rhyming verses, far easier for a young apprentice to remember correctly than a plain, unrhymed list of instructions would have been. This use of rhyme as memory aid, common across a great many oral traditions worldwide, and not unique to her trade alone, meant that a great deal of exact, practical medical knowledge survived accurately across generations, simply because it had been dressed, deliberately, in a shape the memory could hold on to more easily than plain prose. We turn now, one last time, to the thread that has quietly run beneath every single fact we have shared tonight, from the very first to this one. Whatever the specific herb, whatever the specific custom, whatever the specific region or century, everything we have described this evening comes back, in the end to the same simple, patient act, repeated across so many thousands of ordinary days by so many thousands of ordinary women. Someone was unwell or afraid or in pain or bringing new life carefully into the world, and she came and she stayed and she did what she could with what she knew. Let that simple thought be the last one you carry with you tonight, as we let her cottage, her garden, and her whole long, quiet history settle gently into the dark alongside you. Let us turn now to a few last, smaller facts we have not yet found a place for tonight, small enough on their own, but worth including before we close. We turn now to the simple length of her working life, often considerably longer than most other trades of the period allowed. Unlike many physically demanding medieval occupations, which could exhaust or injure a worker well before old age, the wise woman's trade, built more on accumulated knowledge and careful judgment than raw physical strength alone, allowed many women to continue working well into genuine old age, their advancing years adding rather than subtracting from their standing in the community. A wise woman in her 70s or even older, still called upon for a difficult birth or a stubborn fever, was not unusual in the surviving record, her decades of accumulated experience considered, by that point, simply irreplaceable. Let us turn now to the left hand, curiously favored in a number of regional customs concerning the touch of healing itself. Several regional folk traditions specifically favored the left hand for certain healing touches, laying it directly on a fevered brow or a troubled stomach on the belief, recorded in a number of scattered sources, that the left hand carried a gentler, more receptive quality than the right. Whatever the origin of this particular custom, it gave an added layer of small, deliberate ritual to even the most ordinary physical examination. The ordinary act of checking a patient's temperature transformed, by this one small deliberate choice, into something closer to a considered, careful blessing. We turn now to the particular quiet of a sick room she had prepared, and the careful attention paid to more than medicine alone. Beyond whatever remedy she brought, a wise woman attending a seriously ill patient typically took care over the whole environment of the sick room itself, drawing heavy curtains against harsh light, keeping the fire at a steady, moderate warmth, and asking visitors to lower their voices and limit their numbers. This careful shaping of atmosphere, calm, dim and quiet, reflected a genuine, if informally reasoned, understanding that rest and calm surroundings supported recovery every bit as much as any herb, a piece of practical wisdom modern medicine would eventually confirm in its own more formal terms. Let us turn one final time to the quiet, simple word most often used to describe her. Across the greatest number of surviving records, by the very neighbors she served. Strip away the charms, the trials, the herbs, and the long historical detail we have spent this whole evening moving through, and the word that recurs most often across the greatest range of surviving parish records and personal accounts is simply this: trusted. Not feared, not extraordinary, not magical. In the great majority of ordinary village records that happen to mention her at all. Simply, quietly, consistently trusted by the people who knew her best and depended on her most. That single word, more than any other fact we have shared across this whole long evening together, may be the truest and simplest way to remember her. Let us turn now to something we have only touched on lightly so far tonight. The many different shapes her tradition took as it crossed from one corner of Europe to another. Everything we have described tonight, the dooryard garden, the birthing stool, the small spoken charm, held true in broad outline across an enormous stretch of the medieval world, and yet no two regions practiced it in quite the same way. Let us wander for this next stretch of our evening, a little further afield, and see how her tradition looked in a handful of specific places beyond the general village we have imagined together so far. We turn now to Scandinavia, and the particular figure known there as the Vril of Air or the Vihi Sendakona, the seeress or wise woman of the Norse world. In the Norse-speaking regions of Northern Europe, the wise woman's role carried a somewhat stronger association with prophecy and foresight than in many other parts of the continent. Drawing on a much older pre-Christian tradition of Sire, a form of ritual seeing and shaping of fate practiced in the earliest recorded accounts, predominantly by women. By the medieval period proper, this older tradition had blended considerably with the more familiar herbal and midwifery-based practice we have described tonight, but something of the seeress's particular authority, her standing as a reader of coming events, rather than only a healer of present illness, lingered on in the Scandinavian wise woman's reputation for centuries afterward. A Norwegian or Icelandic village facing a hard winter or an uncertain voyage might consult its own wise woman not only for a remedy, but for her sense of what the coming season held, a slightly different emphasis than her counterpart further south, though built from much the same careful, patient, locally rooted knowledge. Let us turn now to Ireland, and the figure known there as the Bean Fisa, literally the woman of knowledge. In Ireland, the Bean Fisa held a role remarkably similar to the wise woman we have described throughout this evening, consulted for illness, for childbirth, and for a wide range of everyday troubles. Her knowledge understood to come partly from herbal skill and partly from a deeper, more mysterious connection to the older world of Irish folklore, including the fairy tradition that remained a living, taken seriously part of rural belief in Ireland for far longer than in most other parts of Europe. A Bean Fisa might be consulted not only about a fever, but about whether a sudden illness had been caused by some offense given, unknowingly, to the good people, the fairies believed to inhabit the hills and raths of the Irish countryside. This particular blending of herbal medicine with a living fairy tradition gave the Irish wise woman's practice a distinctive local flavor that persisted in more remote rural areas, right through into the 19th century and beyond, considerably longer than most of her continental counterparts. We turn now to the Basque country, tucked into the mountains between modern France and Spain, and its own particular tradition of the Belajal, the herb knower. In the Basque-speaking valleys of the Western Pyrenees, the Belajal combined herbal medicine with a strong local tradition of protective charm and blessing. Her knowledge, shaped by the particular plants of a mountainous, isolated landscape, quite different from the lowland herb gardens we have mostly described tonight. Basque folk medicine placed particular emphasis on protecting livestock as well as people, since a mountain household's fortunes depended so heavily on the health of its sheep and cattle, and a skilled Belajal was valued every bit as much for a remedy that saved a flock as for one that eased a fever. The relative isolation of many Basque mountain communities meant this particular tradition survived, in recognizable form, later into the modern period than in many more accessible lowland regions. Preserved partly by simple geographic distance from the centers of formal medicine and formal persecution alike. Let us turn now to the Slavic lands of Eastern Europe and the Znachárka, whose knowledge blended herbal medicine with an unusually rich tradition of protective ritual. Across Poland, Russia, and much of the wider Slavic-speaking world, the Znachárka held a role built from herbal remedy, spoken charm, and an elaborate seasonal calendar of protective custom. Much of it tied to agricultural fertility and the well-being of the household more broadly than to illness alone. She was consulted at key points of the farming year, as much as at the bedside, asked to bless a first ploughing or a first sowing in terms that blended practical agricultural wisdom with the same careful, ritual language she brought to a fever or a difficult birth. This closer tie between healing knowledge and the agricultural calendar reflects how thoroughly, in these rural Slavic communities, the wise woman's authority extended into every corner of village survival, not medicine alone, but the whole delicate balance of a community's yearly fortune. We turn now to the Italian peninsula and the Garatrace, whose practice blended herbal medicine with a strong regional tradition of Catholic devotional charm. In much of medieval and early modern Italy, the Garatrace combined herbal remedy with an unusually close integration of formal Catholic prayer and saintly invocation. Her charms often built almost entirely from recognized prayers rather than the older, more clearly pre-Christian formulas found further north. This closer alignment with formal church devotion may partly explain why several Italian regions, particularly those under certain more cautious ecclesiastical courts, saw considerably less severe persecution of their folk healers than regions further north. The Garatrace's practice simply harder to distinguish in the eyes of a wary local priest from ordinary, sanctioned popular piety. A Garatrace's remedy for a sick child might involve a specific herb alongside a specific, recognized prayer said a fixed number of times. The two elements so thoroughly woven together in her own understanding that separating medicine from devotion would have made little sense to her at all. Let us turn now to the German-speaking lands and the particularly rich written record that survives from certain regions there. The German-speaking territories of medieval and early modern Europe left behind an unusually detailed written record of the Krae Eutaphrose practice, partly because of the region's early and widespread adoption of printing, which allowed herbal knowledge, including a considerable amount originally gathered from folk practitioners, to circulate in printed herbals from a relatively early date. Figures such as Hildegard von Bingen, whom we mentioned earlier tonight, and later printed herbals by authors like Hieronymus Bock, drew consciously on exactly the kind of accumulated local plant knowledge that ordinary wise women across the German lands had built up across generations. This unusually rich written record means historians studying the German tradition today often have considerably more direct textual evidence to work from than in regions where the knowledge remained almost entirely oral. A useful window, even if an imperfect one, into a wider practice that elsewhere left far fainter written traces. We turn now to the Iberian Peninsula and the curandera tradition of Spain and Portugal, still recognizable in some rural communities even today. In Spain and Portugal, the curandera held a role built from herbal medicine, spoken blessing, and a considerable body of practical folk psychology. Since her remit extended to easing what were understood as troubles of fright, grief, and the evil eye alongside more straightforwardly physical illness. This tradition proved remarkably durable, surviving in recognizable form in some rural Spanish and Portuguese communities well into the 20th century, considerably longer than in most of Northern Europe, and elements of it persist, in modified form, in some rural areas even now. The curanderas' continued presence into relatively recent living memory has allowed modern folklorists and anthropologists to study her practice directly, through interview and observation, in ways that are simply impossible for the medieval wise woman further north, whose own voice survives only through the much fainter echoes we have relied upon throughout this evening. Let us turn now to England once more, and the particular local variation between its different counties and regions. Even within England alone, the wise woman's practice varied considerably by region, the herb-rich chalk downs of the south supporting a somewhat different dooryard garden than the damper, more marshland-influenced practice of the eastern fen country, where the recurring egg we described earlier shaped her yearly work far more heavily than it did further inland. Cornwall and the far southwest developed their own particularly rich tradition of charm and folk custom, some of it drawing on older Celtic layers of belief that persisted there later than in most of the rest of England. This patchwork of local variation, repeated across nearly every country we have now discussed, reminds us that there was never really one single wise woman's tradition at all, but rather hundreds of closely related, locally adapted versions of it, each shaped by its own particular landscape, language, and history. We turn now to the surprising degree of similarity that nonetheless runs beneath all of this local variation, connecting a Basque mountain valley to a Norwegian fishing village to an English fen. Despite every regional difference we have just described, the underlying shape of her role remained remarkably consistent across the whole continent, a knowledgeable local woman, trusted with birth and illness, keeping a garden of familiar remedies near her door, blending practical herb craft with spoken blessing, and holding a standing in her community that sat somewhere between ordinary neighbor and quietly respected authority. Historians studying folk healing across medieval Europe have been repeatedly struck by just how similar this basic pattern looks from one end of the continent to the other, arising, it seems, independently and repeatedly wherever a community needed exactly this kind of care. This deep, cross-regional consistency suggests something important about the role itself, that it answered a genuinely universal human need, present in every society we have touched on tonight, for someone patient, knowledgeable, and near at hand to turn to in the frightening, uncertain hours of illness and birth. Let us turn now, more briefly, to the trade routes and pilgrimage roads that occasionally let this knowledge cross even greater distances than usual. Along the major pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe, the road to Santiago de Compostela, most famously among them, a considerable amount of herbal and medical knowledge traveled alongside pilgrims and traders, monastery infirmaries along these roads exchanging remedies and plant knowledge with local wise women in the surrounding countryside. A particularly effective remedy discovered in one region might, over the course of decades, travel remarkably far along exactly these routes, carried not by any formal publication, but simply by word of mouth between healers who happen to cross paths. This slow, informal, person-to-person exchange of knowledge, largely invisible to written history, likely did more to spread effective remedies across medieval Europe than any of the region's more famous, more formally documented medical texts. We turn now to the shared plants, the small handful of herbs that appear under different names in nearly every regional tradition we have described tonight. Despite the different languages, different names, and different specific customs we have surveyed across this whole stretch of our evening, a surprisingly consistent core of plants recurs again and again: chamomile, yarrow, elder, comfrey, and a handful of others appearing in the remedies of Norse cerris and Irish bean fisa and Basque belagil alike, whatever local name each tradition happened to give them. This shared botanical vocabulary, arising independently across such different regions and languages, offers some of the clearest evidence we have that her whole tradition rested, at its foundation, on genuinely careful and largely accurate observation of what these particular plants could actually do. It is a quietly remarkable thing, when you sit with it, that a healer in a Scandinavian fishing village and a healer in an Italian hill town, who could never have spoken to one another or read each other's words, nonetheless arrived independently at very similar conclusions about the same handful of plants, simply by watching closely enough, for long enough, what actually helped. Let us turn now, gently, toward the end of our evening together, and to what actually remains of her, all these centuries later, in the world around us. It would be easy to imagine that a knowledge held so quietly, so rarely written down, and so thoroughly displaced by later, more formal medicine, has simply vanished from the world. It has not. It survives, often in places we would not immediately think to look, in language, in gardens, in the quiet habits of households that have long since forgotten exactly where those habits first came from. We turn now to willow bark and the long, unbroken thread that connects her fevered patients to the medicine cabinet of today. The wise woman's willow bark tea, given for centuries to ease fever and the ache of joints, contains a compound called salicin, closely related to the acetylsalicylic acid that would eventually be refined in the 19th century into aspirin, still among the most widely used medicines in the entire world. She could not have named the compound or explained its chemistry, but her careful, patient, generations-deep observation of which bark eased which pain reached, by an entirely different road, much the same conclusion that a modern laboratory would later confirm. This single thread, running from her fireside brewing pot to a modern pharmacy shelf, is one of the clearest and most concrete pieces of evidence we had that her accumulated knowledge, however informally gathered, was very often simply correct. Let us turn now to honey and its quiet return to modern medical practice after centuries of being set aside as old-fashioned. Honey's use on wounds, so central to her everyday practice, fell out of favor for much of the modern medical era, considered by comparison to newer treatments an old, unscientific habit. In recent decades, however, medical researchers have confirmed genuine antibacterial properties in certain honeys, and medical-grade honey dressings are now used in hospitals and clinics for exactly the kind of stubborn, slow-healing wounds she once treated with a jar from her own kitchen shelf. It is a small, quiet vindication This return of an old remedy through the front door of modern science, and it happened, in most cases, without any conscious memory on the part of the researchers involved that they were simply rediscovering what she had known all along. We turn now to comfrey, and the way her old knitbone poultice still echoes, faintly, in modern topical treatments. The compound found in comfrey, that supports tissue repair allantoin, is still used today in a range of modern skin creams and topical preparations, a direct if largely unacknowledged descendant of the thick root paste she once bound over a broken limb. Comfrey's internal use has grown more cautious in modern practice, following a fuller understanding of certain risks in larger doses, but its topical use for bruises and sprains has never really disappeared at all, simply been repackaged in a small tube rather than a linen wrapping for a different age. Walking past a modern pharmacy shelf and finding a comfrey-based cream sitting quietly among far newer products is, in its own small way, a direct point of contact with her own kitchen shelf, separated by centuries, but recognizably the very same plant, put to recognizably the very same purpose. Let us turn now to the words she left behind, tucked quietly into language most of us use every day without a second thought. A surprising number of ordinary phrases in several European languages preserve a faint trace of her old practice. Expressions about being under the weather, about a matter coming to a head, about tying up loose ends, all carrying, if you trace them back far enough, an echo of the older folk medicine and folk magic she once practiced as a matter of course. Few speakers today would recognize these small linguistic fossils for what they are, and yet they persist quietly, every single day in ordinary conversation. Language, it turns out, remembers a great deal more than written history alone tends to preserve, carrying forward small fragments of an entire vanished world of practice within phrases we now use without a single thought. We turn now to the birthing stools, mortars, and digging knives preserved today in regional folk museums across Europe. A number of regional museums, particularly in England, Germany, and the Scandinavian countries, hold preserved examples of exactly the tools we described earlier tonight. Birthing stools worn smooth by generations of use, heavy stone mortars, small white-handled digging knives kept carefully separate from ordinary kitchen blades. These physical objects, quiet and unglamorous as they are, offer a direct, tangible connection to her actual daily life that no written record, however detailed, can quite match. Standing before a glass case holding one of these worn, plain, deeply used objects, it is possible to feel, in a way words alone rarely achieve, just how real and how physically demanding her long working life actually was. Let us turn now to the modern midwifery movement and its own conscious, deliberate return to some of what she once knew. Beginning in the later 20th century, a growing movement within modern midwifery began deliberately revisiting some of the very practices the wise woman had long championed. Upright birthing positions, continuous one-on-one support through labor, a slower, more patient approach to childbirth than the more clinical model that had displaced it over the preceding centuries. This was rarely framed by the midwives leading the movement as returning to superstition. It was framed instead, quite reasonably, as recognizing that a great deal of accumulated practical wisdom had been too quickly discarded in an earlier rush toward purely clinical, hospital-based birth. In this quiet, deliberate return, something of her own careful, patient approach to labor has found its way back into modern practice, carried not by memory of her specifically, but by a fresh, independent rediscovery of much the same underlying wisdom. We turn now to the herbalists and gardeners today who deliberately keep alive the plants she once relied upon. Heritage seed banks and physic gardens across Europe today deliberately preserve varieties of rue, feverfew, comfrey, and dozens of other plants once central to her practice, growing them not primarily for medicine, but for history. A living collection meant to keep a whole vanished world of knowledge, at least partly accessible to anyone curious enough to walk through the garden gate. Several of these gardens are planted specifically to recreate the layout a medieval wise woman's own dooryard might once have followed, the same plants growing in roughly the same close, crowded arrangement she herself would have kept. Visiting such a garden today, walking the same narrow paths between the same close-planted herbs, offers about as close an experience to standing in her own dooryard as the modern world can still provide. Let us turn now to the modern herbalists, who have deliberately sought to relearn something of her older, oral tradition of practice. Across the last several decades, a renewed interest in traditional herbal medicine has led a number of modern practitioners to seek out and carefully document exactly the kind of orally transmitted plant knowledge that so many wise women once carried entirely in memory. Interviewing elderly relatives, combing old regional folklore collections, and cross-referencing surviving fragments of charm and remedy against what little written record exists. This patient, painstaking work of reconstruction, however incomplete it must inevitably remain, represents a genuine, ongoing effort to recover something of what was so nearly lost entirely. Every fragment successfully recovered in this way, a single half-remembered rhyme, a single confirmed old recipe, restores just a little more of a knowledge that came astonishingly close, across the intervening centuries, to disappearing without any trace at all. We turn now to the family names that, in several European languages, still quietly preserve a memory of her trade. Surnames such as Wise, Hale, and Leach in English, or their equivalents in other European languages, descend in many documented cases directly from an ancestor who practiced exactly the kind of healing work we have spent tonight describing, a family name that has long since detached from its original meaning, and yet still, quietly, carries it forward. A family bearing one of these old names today very likely has, somewhere many generations back, a wise woman or a village healer standing at the root of their own particular line. It is a strange and rather lovely thought that a name spoken today at the school gate or on a delivery parcel might, traced back far enough, lead directly to a cottage at the edge of some long-forgotten medieval village, and the quiet, careful woman who once kept it. Let us turn now to the fairy tale figure of the wise woman in the woods, and how directly she descends from the real women we have described tonight. The gentle, knowledgeable old woman who appears throughout European folklore, living alone at the forest edge, offering advice, remedy, or warning to travelers who cross her path, draws directly and unmistakably on the real, historical figure of the village wise woman, softened and reshaped across generations of storytelling into something closer to legend. Even as her real historical presence faded from most villages, this fictional echo of her carried on, told and retold, long after the last genuine cunning woman had passed her basket on to a final apprentice or simply set it down for good. In this quiet way, story succeeded where formal memory largely failed, keeping some faint outline of her alive in the popular imagination for centuries, after her actual daily practice had faded from most of the villages she once served. We turn now to the commonplace books and household recipe collections, kept mostly by women, that preserved fragments of her knowledge in writing after all. Beginning in the later medieval period and continuing for centuries afterward, many literate women kept what were called commonplace books, private household collections of recipes, remedies, and useful knowledge copied down over a lifetime, often including exactly the kind of herbal remedy a village wise woman might have shared with a friend or relative. A number of these books survive today in regional archives, offering historians a rare, direct written record of remedies that would otherwise have vanished along with the oral tradition that first produced them. These quiet, private books, kept for entirely practical household reasons rather than any thought of history, have become, quite unexpectedly, some of our very best surviving evidence of what her actual, everyday remedies looked like in her own words, or at least in the words of the women who learned directly from her. Let us turn now to the modern scientific validation of several of her most widely used remedies, confirmed, centuries later, by careful laboratory study. Beyond willow bark and honey, a number of her other staple remedies have since received at least partial confirmation from modern pharmacological research. Chamomile's genuine mild calming properties, yarrow's real effect on blood clotting, elderberry's demonstrated support for the immune system during a cold. None of this research was undertaken with her specifically in mind, and a great many of her other remedies remain simply untested either way. But where testing has occurred, it has confirmed, more often than skeptics might expect, that her long, patient, entirely empirical observation had already found what a laboratory would later measure. This pattern of quiet vindication, repeating across so many of her individual remedies, invites a certain humility about how much careful, patient observation alone, sustained across many generations, can actually achieve, even entirely without the formal tools of modern science. We turn now, to close this chapter gently, to the simple, continuous thread of care that runs from her hands to ours, whether we know her name or not. Every time a modern mother is offered a warm bath and a calm, steady presence rather than only clinical instruction through a difficult labor, every time a grieving family is comforted as much by a caring neighbor's presence as by any medicine, every time a grandmother's old remedy for a cold is quietly passed down and tried before anything from the pharmacy, something of her particular patient, hands-on tradition of care continues, whether or not anyone involved has ever once thought of the medieval wise woman at all. That, more than any single surviving object or written recipe, may be her truest legacy. Not a museum piece, not a preserved garden, but a way of caring for the people nearest to us, patiently, practically, and without any need for fanfare, that has simply never entirely gone away. Let us turn now, for the last stretch of our evening together, back to the garden itself, and take one final, unhurried walk through it before we close. The night has gone fully dark outside the wise woman's small window now. The candle on her workbench has burned low, its flame small and steady. We have come a long way tonight, from her cottage door to her birthing room, from her kitchen fire to the harder chapters of suspicion and loss, and back again, at last, to something gentler. Let us spend these final facts simply among her plants once more, the way she herself might have chosen to end a long working day. We turn now to rosemary, and the particular kind of remembering it was thought to carry. Rosemary held a double reputation in her practice, valued both for its practical medicine, a warming liniment for aching joints, a rinse said to darken and strengthen the hair, and for its deep association with memory and remembrance more broadly. Sprigs of rosemary were placed at gravesides across much of medieval Europe, and a bride might weave it into her wedding wreath in the very same season a mourner carried it to a fresh grave, the plant equally at home marking a beginning or an ending. A wise woman planting rosemary near her own door was, in a small and quiet way, planting a kind of promise that whatever she herself had learned and practiced across a long working life would somehow, through the plant if nothing else, be remembered. Let us turn now to lavender once more, closing the circle we opened with it near the very start of tonight. We spoke earlier of lavender's place in the convents of Provence and the pillows of frightened children. It belongs here again at the end of our evening for a simpler reason. Of everything in her whole garden, lavender was perhaps the plant most consistently associated, across the greatest number of regions and centuries, with sleep itself, tucked beneath pillows, scattered dried among bedlines, its oil rubbed gently at the temples of anyone who could not settle. It was, in its own quiet way, the very first sleep remedy this whole tradition ever really had. If you are still listening at all by this point in our evening, let the thought of it be enough. A small handful of dried lavender, gathered by careful hands centuries ago, tucked beneath a stranger's pillow with nothing asked in return but a quieter night. We turn now to chamomile, gentlest of all her herbs and fitting company as we near the end. We met chamomile too, right back at the beginning of tonight, the small daisy flower of the meadow, gathered for restless evenings and fretful children. There is a reason it recurs so often across her whole practice, and across nearly every other wise woman's practice from one end of Europe to the other. It asked almost nothing difficult of the person using it, worked gently rather than dramatically, and rarely caused any harm, even when a nervous mother measured its dose a little generously. In a trade built so often around careful, exact, sometimes dangerous quantities, chamomile was the one herb she could offer almost without a second thought. Perhaps that is worth remembering, at the very close of an evening built around her whole complicated, demanding, sometimes dangerous body of knowledge. Not every remedy she gave required exact caution. Some, like this one, asked only warmth and patience and a little hot water. Let us turn now to the elder tree once more, standing quietly at the edge of her garden, as it did at the edge of so many medieval gardens across the whole continent. We spoke of the elder mother earlier, and the careful respect she was owed before a single branch was cut. It seems fitting to return to her here, at the close, this old, generous, quietly guarded tree that gave the wise woman flowers for fever and berries for the winter cough, and asked only, in return, that she pause a moment and ask permission before taking what she needed. It is not a difficult thing to ask of anyone. A pause, a few words, a little gratitude before the taking. Perhaps this, more than any single remedy, captures something of her whole approach to the world around her, careful, grateful, unhurried, taking only what was needed, and always leaving something behind for whoever or whatever came next. We turn now to the honeybee, humming quietly at the edge of nearly every garden we have described tonight. Bees appear again and again across this whole evening, drawn to the lemon balm, kept for the honey that sweetened her bitter tinctures and dressed her wounds, watched carefully for signs of a coming storm, long before the swallows themselves took flight. A wise woman's relationship with her own hives was often described, in the few personal accounts that survive, with real warmth. A working partnership between herself and a creature she genuinely admired for its own quiet, patient industry, not so very different, perhaps, from her own. There is an old custom, recorded in several regions, of telling the bees important household news, a birth, a death, a marriage, murmured quietly at the hive itself, as though the bees, too, deserved to know. It is a small, tender detail to end on. This idea that even the insects of her garden were treated with a little of the same careful courtesy she extended to everything else around her. Let us turn now to the dew itself, gathered before dawn for reasons beyond even the herbs it settled upon. Beyond its role in the timing of her gathering, dew held its own small reputation in her practice, collected sometimes in a clean cloth wrung out into a bottle, kept as a gentle wash for tired eyes or troubled skin. May dew specifically, gathered on the first morning of May across a wide stretch of European folk custom, was held in particularly high regard, believed to carry a special freshness found at no other point in the year. Young women in several regions rose before dawn on this one morning, specifically to wash their faces in it. A small, hopeful ritual, half medicine and half simple, cheerful custom. It is a gentle image to hold on to. A whole village of young women moving quietly through wet grass in the grey hour before sunrise, and the wise woman among them, or perhaps a little ahead of them, already at work. We turn now to the hearth fire itself, always burning somewhere near the center of everything we have described tonight. Nearly every remedy in this whole evening, from the simplest infusion to the most careful caudle, passed at some point across the wise woman's own hearth fire, warmed, steeped, or simmered in the same steady heat that also cooked her family's ordinary supper. This fire, kept alive through every season, through every difficult night, and every quiet, ordinary one, was in its own way the true, unchanging center of her whole practice, the one constant beneath everything else that varied from season to season and year to year. If you have been picturing that fire at all tonight, small and steady in a low stone cottage at the edge of some half-imagined medieval village, you have been picturing, as closely as any of us can now manage, something very like her actual daily world. Let us turn now to the apprentice once more, grown now into a wise woman herself, carrying the whole of what we have described tonight forward into a village of her own. We spoke earlier of the girl who learned by watching, who held the cloth before she was trusted to strain it herself, who gathered nettle at dawn beside an aunt or a mother long before she understood why the timing mattered. By the time she has grown into her own basket, her own drying loft, her own dooryard garden planted with rue and feverfew beside her own front step, she carries forward everything we have spent this whole evening describing, not as history, but simply as her own ordinary daily work. This quiet, continuous handing forward, mother to daughter, aunt to niece, teacher to willing apprentice, repeated countless times across countless villages and countless centuries, is really the truest shape of her whole story. Not one woman, but an unbroken line of them, each one adding her own small refinement before passing the basket on. We turn now, nearly at the last, to the simple fact of her ordinary, unremarked, daily kindness. Across everything we have described tonight, the charms and the remedies, the birthing stools and the drying lofts, the trials and the quiet vindications that followed centuries later, one thread runs through absolutely all of it. She showed up. Whatever the hour, whatever the weather, whatever the trouble, she came when called, basket in hand, and did what she could with what she knew. That, more than any single herb or any single remedy, was the actual heart of her whole practice. It is, perhaps, the simplest and most enduring fact of everything we have shared tonight, and the truest reason her story, in one quiet form or another, has never entirely disappeared. Let us turn, finally, to the candle on her own workbench, burning low now as our evening together draws toward its close. We began tonight imagining that small candle alight in her window, a sign to anyone traveling in the dark that help was awake and waiting. We end here with the same candle, burned down now to its last patient inch, the fire beside it settled into quiet embers, the cottage around it finally still. Whatever calls might come before dawn, she has, for this 1 hour at least, allowed herself simply to rest. Let us allow ourselves the very same thing now, and let her candle, and this whole long, quiet gathering of 100 small facts about her, settle gently into the dark alongside us. We have wandered a very long way tonight, from a cottage at the edge of a medieval village, through her garden and her hedgerow, her kitchen and her birthing room, her charms and her long, complicated relationship with the fear of her own neighbors, and finally back again to something as simple as a candle burning low. If your eyes closed somewhere along the way, that was always exactly the point of the evening, and there is nothing at all to have missed. There is nothing left to remember, and nothing left to do. The basket is set down by the door. The fire has settled into its last soft glow. Somewhere beyond the window, the village she spent her whole life quietly tending has gone fully, peacefully still, and it is time now for you to do the very same. Sleep well. Let every muscle soften, one by one, from your forehead down to your feet, heavier and heavier, sinking gently into wherever you are resting. The quiet apothecary will be here again soon, with another slow evening, another quiet cupboard of remedies and stories, whenever you are ready to return. For now there is only this, the low, steady dark, the last of the candle's light fading gently to nothing, and the whole of a long night ahead of you, unhurried, uninterrupted, entirely your own. Good night.